on pupils' reading habits. Prior to lockdown in February here in Italy, we had read 42 out of the 92. From this, wonderful discussions about books happened almost daily, and pupils were reading books that perhaps they might not have chosen themselves. In addition, all parents want a good reading list, and the Carnegie list means sometimes your work is done. Book speed dating and other challenges. Now, obviously, I don't refer to it as book speed dating with my pupils, but it is a fantastic activity I do at the start of every big term with my pupils. I share a slide of the reading I completed over the holiday and talk them through that reading, what I enjoyed, why I enjoyed it. I then ask pupils to form 2 rows facing each other. The first person has 30 seconds to tell their partner about the best book they read over the holidays, and then they swap. And then all pupils move to the left one space and the process is repeated. The buzz and volume of talk going on with regard to reading is second to none. At the end, I tell my pupils, well, having read all of my books over the holiday, I need some new recommendations, and ask them what they have for me. Now, some people will challenge this in terms of saying, well, what about those who don't read over the holidays? Firstly, I think as a teacher, I need to know about this and again, respond to this. But secondly, I do know that every child has read a book, even if this is within class. So I tell them to speak about their favorite book or the last book they read, and it becomes the best start to every single term. Obviously, there is an opportunity for library lessons where pupils can privately read. I'm changing my approach to library lessons, and we'll talk about this a little later, but I must reference our amazing school librarians who do a wonderful job in promoting reading. Our librarian, Amber, who is amazing, organises competitions, read aloud sessions, which I have to contribute to today, and various other events. Reading in other subjects is equally important, and it's interesting for us as English specialists or leaders or literacy leaders to know what other subjects are recommending. Mary Meyer always refers to a humanities teacher who recommends reading from a publication like The New Economist. I'm not sure that's the right one, but the calibre is the same. They read an article at home, and then a discussion ensues the following lesson about that article. In my old role as literacy leader in whole school teaching and learning, once I'd established classroom libraries in English, I moved on to humanities and science and so forth, enabling pupils to have access to a wider range of literature for any given subject. Tutor time reading I first saw at Michaela and then later at Magna and Paul, and I would definitely recommend going to see these schools in action. My old school committed £3,000 to buying in tutor time books, and this is simply another space where reading can occur with the tutor reading to the pupils and comprehension explored through Oracy. In assemblies are usually driven by a school's core values, and there is always an appropriate passage that can be found to support a key message. Drawing upon literature in public gatherings is another way of giving text real prominence. During journeys, perhaps a bit context specific here, but many of our pupils travel in by bus each day, some a fairly lengthy journey. So there is an opportunity to read there or to listen to a podcast or an audiobook. Linked reading, I'll talk about later. And finally, reading with parents. I worked with a fantastic head of year in my old school. She identified after some AR testing the pupils in her year group who were below 10 in reading age. Working with a colleague of mine in the English department, she put together a program of how to support your child with reading. And over a number of weeks, she invited the parents and their children in and delivered this program, sharing a range of strategies to improve reading habits and comprehension and give them a space to read. Lo and behold, the pupils' reading ages dramatically improved. These are just some of the opportunities I've created over the years, and it would be really lovely to see you sharing via the chat any ideas you've tried at your schools to maximise the opportunity for reading. I always say that the best practitioners are the assimilators, and that's definitely true for me. So I'm after some new things to try. Secondly, I want to talk about the maximisation of the breadth of reading. I have most often spoken out in recent years about the dichotomy that seems to exist about what we should and should not be reading with our pupils. I am, for the record, anti the dead white man curriculum. Don't get me wrong, I love Charles Dickens, but Charles Dickens' voice isn't the only voice we need to hear. Since the brutal murder of George Floyd, we have seen a much healthier dialogue emerging within the education community. A dialogue that has moved away from debate and dichotomy, and that is now focused on the question of breadth. And that is a much healthier place to find ourselves in. Instead of polarizing, we need to refocus this dialogue and ask ourselves, how broad is our curriculum offering? Both of these writers articulate the need for breadth in our curriculum perfectly. Reed, in the new Research Ed Guide to Curriculum, states, when considering the curriculum, we cannot erase writers of colour, but nor should we deny the foundational place in the world of Dickens, Hardy and Bronte. We need our students to read Jane Eyre, but we need them to read Why Does Sargasso Sea too? We have to teach all of it, what has been remembered and what has been forgotten, and how this came to be. Whilst Adichie, whose speech features within the IGCSE curriculum, states that stories matter. Many stories matter. Stories have been used to dispossess and to malign, but stories can also be used to empower and to humanize. Stories can break the dignity of a people, but stories can also repair that broken dignity. Now, I think, first of all, we have to be role models here. We have to show our pupils that we are readers and that our reading is broad, and broad in many, many ways. This is my reading this year so far. I'm a bit down at the moment, so don't tell anybody about that. But I share this constantly with my pupils. And I share this constantly with my pupils because I want them to know that I am a reader and that I read broadly. But secondly, this has to come through our curriculum offering. I am fortunate enough to teach the IB, and this is my Year 12 curriculum from next year, something I'm so proud and excited to teach. There are bits that I still need to add to this. It isn't perfect, but what it does do is it tells many stories. And this is something I personally feel I have a responsibility to do as I educate our future global citizens. Now, many people will say that they don't have the luxury of this at GCSE, and I do understand this. Kudos to Edexcel for moving on this, and I would urge teachers to write to their exam boards to encourage their exam boards to do the same. But as always, let's not focus on what we can't control and instead think about what we can do. And I think this begins with Key Stage 3. So, controversially, I start my curriculum with Barnaby Bucket. I say this because it isn't canonical, and some people would argue its level of challenge. Well, having considered the Tier 2 vocabulary in the BL, there is enough in there. And secondly, I've chosen this book because for the start of Year 7, because conceptually, it is a wonderful thing to start Year 7 with. It is a book about identity and a boy who is rejected by his parents because of an aspect of his identity. He is released into the world and on his journey meets a range of people who have been rejected by their loved ones because of aspects of their identity, their sexuality, the choices they make, a disability. Barnaby eventually returns to his parents, and I'm sorry for the spoiler here, his parents continue to refuse to accept him as he is. So he decides instead that he is confident with who he is, he loves who he is, and decides to go back into the big wide world, having made many friends along the way. Now, the IB has introduced me to a concept-driven curriculum, which I am currently feeding down through the key stages. And so in choosing this book, I've chosen to focus on the concept of identity, something I think is really pertinent to Year 7 and the changes they go through as they join secondary school. But I've also chosen to focus on the related concept of character. The key concepts provided by the IB are generic concepts, whilst the related concepts taken from the Middle Years programme are domain-specific. But why am I telling you this? Because in being clear on the key concept and the related concept or concepts I want to address helps me to develop the breadth of my curriculum. And I just want to do an MB there to Mary, who spoke earlier about this in the week, a concept-based curriculum, and will speak again, I think, at Team English. If Mary's here, she might be able to let you in on that. So within each unit I teach, I have identified a linked non-fiction and linked fiction. The term linked is used instead of wider, and this is something I've heard from either Bob Cox or Barbara Blyman. Wider makes it seem more effortful, whilst linked really emphasises the relevance to what we are doing in the classroom. The linked non-fiction is linked to the key concept of identity and the struggles that many individuals have faced over time because of their own identity, this being central to the novel we are reading. These extracts from a variety of non-fiction texts, I haven't yet decided the full range, will be offered as flipped learning, much like the humanities teacher Mary Myatt references. They will be timed to correspond with particular sections of the text and brought into the lesson as a linked discussion point. There will be some core aspect of literacy that I will be addressing through these texts, but that's for another talk perhaps. In the main, the purpose of these non-fiction texts is to widen the discussion around the key concept of identity and to give pupils the breadth of experience. Oracy is a massive part of what we do in the international sector. And if I'm honest, we talk often of the gap between advantage and disadvantage with a focus on knowledge. But Oracy is also a massive marker for me. Having worked in disadvantaged schools for the majority of my career and also with one of the most elite private schools in England and now a fee-paying international school in Italy, one of the stark differences between pupils is their confidence in expressing themselves, in having an opinion, in debating and discussing in a sophisticated way. And whilst I understand that you need knowledge in order to be able to do that, it is something that needs to be given more attention. So at IB, all students undertake an individual oral in which they have to do a 10-minute presentation on how a literary text and a non-fiction work presents a global issue. I think this is something that could be done in a much more informal capacity at Key Stage 3 to help pupils reflect upon the impact that texts have on them. So towards the end of my unit on Barnaby Brocket, I'm going to ask my pupils to choose an extract from the novel that has had most impact on them in conveying ideas about identity. And I'm going to ask them to choose one of the extracts from the non-fiction bank that they feel has really spoken to them about identity. And then I'm going to ask them to reflect upon how both texts have conveyed key messages in relation to our key concept. I'm thinking I'm going to set this as a homework task and ask pupils to produce a Loom or a screencast or a PowerPoint presentation with audio, given our newly developed technical expertise. And then these can be shared via one of our school platforms. I'm thinking that I'm going to direct pupils to watch 2 to 3 of these presentations and comment on these presentations and allow the person who has presented to respond. The focus here very much is to empower pupils to consider what it is they have learned about our key concept, reflect upon the power of text in conveying those messages, and to develop oracy skills in the process, utilising a structure from the IB. So on to linked fiction, and this is where I try to present myself as a reflective practitioner. As we've given greater consideration to curriculum design, many English practitioners have argued for a curriculum that is chronological. I've never felt that that quite works for me, but having seen the awe-inspiring Kat Howard and really reflected upon her work, I do think it is important that pupils have a good grounding in the literary timeline and understand where the texts they study fit within that. But curriculum planning is complex, and if I don't want to teach my texts in chronological order, how could I broach this? Well, I've decided to centre my library lessons around this. And as you can see here on my curriculum map across Key Stage 3, pupils are introduced to each of the literary time periods, so that by the time pupils finish Key Stage 3 and begin their IGCSEs and their IB curriculum, they have a solid grounding of literature over time. So what might this look like? Again, taken from the brilliant Kat Howard and Susan Strachan, my sequence of library lessons will start with a lecture about the given literary period. So when exploring Old English or Middle English, I will give a lecture on that time period, providing an overview of key moments, key influences, and key aspects of that literary period. Pupils will then be exposed in a number of library lessons to extracts from that literary period. However, these extracts will be placed within a wider anthology that can be explored in later library lessons. The anthology will be organised around the related concept. So in my unit on Barnaby Brocket, the related concept is character, and so my first anthology is made up of character descriptions. The first idea being that pupils need multiple exposures to something in order to be able to understand it and then construct their own. The second idea being that when they come to write their own character descriptions, they have a broader range of exemplars to draw upon. But these character descriptions are placed within a literary context and organised chronologically. They are referenced within their literary period. And when you start to look at some of the characters, there is a lot contextually that can be drawn out. Each extract will be accompanied by a number of activities that address the concept of characterisation and the literary period from whence it came. But having read the wonderful Chris Curtis's blog last week, sometimes we can just read for pleasure's sake. In trying to approach it in this way, I'm hoping to increase the breadth, but also provide my pupils with the opportunity to develop a richer understanding of the different literary periods, which will really support their future learning. In Unit 2, when I look at poems from different cultures, the linked fiction will focus on settings, for example. And finally, I want to draw all of this reading together. our main literary reading, our linked fiction reading, and our linked non-fiction reading. And I want to do this using Oracy. In Italy, pupils in state education sit what is called the terza media exam at the end of year 9. As part of this exam, pupils have to present to a panel of teachers their learning from that year. It starts with an essay that draws upon a range of disciplines and then moves into questions from a panel. Although terrifying, I think this is an excellent opportunity to promote our reading across a year and our reflections of this in line with the key concept. And so I'm introducing a terza media style presentation at the end of each year within Key Stage 3. For example, in Year 7, our concept, as you know, is identity. In Term 1, we explore Bernard B. Brockett and the theme of personal identity. In Term 2, we explore poetry from other cultures and the concept of cultural identity. In Term 3, we explore a range of extracts from Shakespeare's plays and focus on the female characters to consider gender identity, with a bit of Disney thrown in. We have also, by this point, explored a range of linked fiction and non-fiction reading. Around 4 weeks prior to the end of the school year, I will provide pupils with a question. The question for Year 7 will be something like, how important is the written word in conveying ideas about identity? And from this, I will ask my pupils to create a 5 to 10 minute presentation exploring how successfully the texts they've studied across the year have conveyed ideas about identity. The text they choose to refer to will be up to them, but the focus is reflecting upon their reading across the year with a key concept in mind. In doing so, what I'm hoping to invoke in my readers is a sense of the impact that texts have on us and our understanding of ourselves and the wider world. And so finally, when thinking about reading culture, I think we should use what is already out there and available for free. Read Theory is a reading platform that provides pupils with short extracts and associated questions. I currently use this with Year 7 as part of their homework program, and next year the department will be using this tool across Year 7 and Year 8. Read Theory provides pupils with a pretest which ascertains their grade level. It is American, so needs to have a quick conversion, but it gives you a sense of their reading ages. The blue line is the current grade level pupils are in, so as a teacher you can quickly see who is above, who is on, and who is below. Once the pretest is done, pupils use the short extracts and quiz on these. You get a wide range of information as a teacher, including the results of the quizzes, and the different colours tell you how many answers were below pupils' pretest score, how many were on, and how many were above. Having worked with this programme for a year, it is of no surprise that in the main, the more quizzes pupils took and the more success they had with these, the more their reading ages improved. And after doing student feedback, at least 75% of my Year 7 students really felt that it benefited their reading. Now from Year 9 up, however, we use another free programme called Common Lit. Again, longer passages are provided with a range of questions. A pretest is provided and a rich amount of data from the pretest is shared, both in terms of performance, but also in relation to key skills such as comprehension and inference. What is amazing about Common Lit is its growing library, with many extracts linked to core literature texts and organised thematically. That offers you a wealth of text to explore. In addition, there are a number of features which are so useful to support pupils with their reading. You can enlarge the text. You can have the text read to you. The text can be translated into a wide number of different languages. You can annotate the text. The features are endless. Again, there are guiding questions and assessment questions which pupils complete. And in the main, these are marked for you and the data fed back. It is a brilliant tool. So finally, I'm pretty much coming to the end of my presentation. These are some of the things that I would like to work on next year. I would like to develop book reviews, and I'd like to do more shared book reviews, maybe through Firefly. We do have a YouTube channel at my school, and I'd like to have an English section on that, and some video book reviews would be amazing. I'd like to get regular book reviews in our weekly school newsletter. I'd like to extend the challenges that I do with my class across the different year groups. And this period of time has shown us that anything really is possible. Getting authors over to us here in Italy is somewhat harder, so maybe we could do something more remotely. I'd also like to promote our reading for pleasure, but also to enhance our subject knowledge, especially if you are teaching text for the first time or if you're an NQT. When I know what I'm teaching, I try to get my hands on absolutely everything to do with that text to improve my own subject knowledge. If you can, ask your HODs to buy one copy of everything for your departmental library. Utilise the blog posts, use the lectures from LitDrive to read, and read again, and make sure your subject knowledge is the strongest. And finally, this is my final slide. These are my go-tos when it comes to reading. I think Alice has surpassed me in terms of her reading knowledge, and she's absolutely fantastic at offering ideas and suggestions for reading on Twitter. Simon and Ashley are fantastic primary practitioners who are always talking about reading. Disappointingly, Ashley's hair isn't like that in real life. Those are the 4 books that have influenced my thinking the most with regard to reading and will continue to do so. And of course, I can't not recommend the Carnegie list, which for me always frames my reading with regard to youth fiction. I am rubbish at asking questions, but please feel free to obviously get in touch with me via Twitter, via FOD3. That is me done.
Thank you, Freya. That was brilliant. That was amazing. Can you stop sharing your screen, please, so we can do the questions? Yeah, fantastic. Okay. So first of all, great job. We've had like more than 920 people watching a presentation here. Plus, this is all live streaming on YouTube. So I don't know how many people are watching there, but lots. So thank you very much. And there are a few questions that were asked during your presentation. So Alexandra asked right in the beginning that she says she likes the idea of I am reading poster, but how does that work really? Is it with tutor groups?
Yeah, really, really good question. I think you need to decide whether it's going to be more of a curriculum thing or a tutor group thing. For me, I like doing it with my English classes. I am conscious I have a year 7 group next year, so it might be something, but there is then that problem of you running out of wall space. So I think you have to choose whether that's going to be a curriculum focus or a tutor pastoral focus.
Yeah. And then also about one of the techniques that you shared, Loretta asked, how do you manage to do the post-it notes on the wall when you have hundreds of children going in and out of your classroom? How does that actually get to work?
Sellotape helps.
Right.
And putting them in spaces potentially where pupils won't rub up against. I'm assuming physically. I mean, I don't have full names on the wall, so I just have a first name if that's from a different angle.
Yeah. Okay, great. So some more bigger questions now. A few people saying that they don't have a lot of funding in their schools for libraries and books. Do you have any advice on how they can get more funding or any alternative if they can't buy books?
Yeah, I appreciate that. That is really difficult. And I was really, really lucky that my old school were really supportive of that. I do think it has to come down to how supportive your SLT are in terms of reading and how much of a focus that is for your school. I think also one thing I did try at my old school was reaching out to the community and saying to the community, we want to build classroom libraries. We're really keen to build classroom libraries. Right. You know, are there any books that you finished with that you could contribute towards? And I remember actually a number of parents bringing bags of books to our school to contribute to that. So I understand that is a real problem. And I think actually it's a long-term thing, isn't it? That you buy new books every year with what you have.
Yep. So also talking about schools with different backgrounds, Jade asked if you have any ideas for promoting reading with students in a pupil referral unit.
Really good question. And I have no experience with pupil referral units. So that would be something that I would want to think about. I mean, I am rubbish. Sorry, Jade. I'm rubbish at answering questions on the spot. And
No,
I prefer to say I'd like to go away and think about that rather than give you a really rubbish response. I think it always comes back to that enthusiasm of reading and choosing books that tell great stories. For me, when I'm choosing my books on my curriculum, I am thinking about the stories that I know will engage my readers and offer some challenge. There are other things to consider as well, but I think great stories and your enthusiasm and love for reading would be my initial response, but I would definitely have to go away and think about that.
Yep, that's great. There are nice questions about parents. So how important is it to motivate parents to read as well? So increase this culture of reading with parents, not only with the children.
Absolutely. I think it's really, really critical. And I do think it's something that here in Italy, in my school, we have a lot of very supportive parents who understand the importance of reading and the value of reading and are on board with that. And they are pretty good at wanting reading lists. And we're currently putting that together for summer because that is an expectation. The head of year work that Kirsty, my ex-colleague, did was absolutely fantastic. And I think that's a really good opportunity and a good way to start. And I think other parent information evenings and parent support evenings is another good opportunity. But yeah, that is a real barrier. And it is massively important that parents are supportive of reading and encouraging reading and sitting down with their children with reading. But I do think having looked at the work that Kirsty did, a lot of parents don't know how to support their children with comprehension. They don't know how to support their children with improving their reading. And so what that workshop did was really open up that dialogue and say, this is how you can support, this is what you can do. And I think the more we communicate that, the better.
Yep, that's very good advice. Caitlin asked if you incorporate writing tasks as well into each term when you're doing the reading.
Yeah, absolutely. I haven't spoken about writing, and I haven't spoken about writing because I don't consider myself to be such an expert on that. And actually, I've just started the amazing C-Teach program, and it's going to be one of my areas of focus. But absolutely, writing is absolutely central and at the heart of what we do. And the character descriptions thing that I was talking about, they will go on to write their own character descriptions. Right. And having read Jenny's work and looked at Jenny's work, I'm going to do one writing lesson every week that will then layer up to that character description at the end.
Okay, yep, sounds good. Another question about leadership. How would you recommend, I didn't get the name of the person who asked, sorry. How would you recommend getting your SLT approval to create more time in the timetable for reading? They saying that they only have 5 minutes at a time for tutor group reading. Doesn't seem a lot.
That's a really, really good question. And I haven't done DEAR for a long time. I think it's about going back to the important, again, I'd like to go away and think of what I would do strategically and give myself some time to think about that, because I think that's a really important thing. I mean, I've always worked with SLT teams who have really valued reading and understand the importance of it. I think tutor time is a really good negotiating space for that, because we're always looking for things to do with regard to our tutor time and activities there. But yeah, I would go away and have a think about that. Sorry, rubbish response. I am rubbish at questions.
No, that's great. So some people asking for recommendations. So first, ideas for books for 16 plus, so older kids. And also Mandy, I think, asked, what book have you ever thought that had the most worthwhile response from your students?
Oh, amazing question. So with regard to book recommendations, I think Alice is an absolute expert. I think Alice is on here. I would always refer people to Alice. I think she's overtaken me. So I don't read as much as Alice. So Alice is the expert there. What I would say with the older students is, again, try and link it into the books that you're doing. So I'm teaching Chronicle of a Death Foretold. So I would probably go back to the core themes and the core concepts and books that relate to that. In terms of the most worthwhile, I have to say, hands down, this year, Long Way Down has had the most impact on my pupils, both from a conceptual point of view, but also from their reflections in terms of how much that book has taught them about poetry. So Long Way Down for me, the most impact.
Yeah, sounds great. Well, that was fantastic. We're out of time now, but thank you very much.
I'm going to have a glass of wine now.
There are still other questions. So everybody, if I didn't get to ask your questions, just go on Twitter, tag Freya, tag Seneca, use the hashtags, and then she'll answer them there, right?
Perfect. Great. Yeah, do get in touch with me via Twitter at FOD3.
Yeah, amazing. So thank you very much, Freya. And now our next speaker is Patrice Miller. So Patrice, are you there?
All right, I've just unmuted myself.
Yeah.
And I've got to find my screen again. Sorry, I knew this was going to happen again.
That's all right. Just go for share your screen.
There it goes. Share. Okay.
Yeah.
Is that showing?
Yeah.
Okay. All right. Lovely.
Oh,
So,
hang on, it's loading.
Just
wait 1 second.
Here we go.
Okay, there you go.
Maximum impact and progression within my classroom, and arguably they're realty pupils. Okay, and our grades sit between 61 and 62% for across both English subjects. So there's still a lot of room and a lot of growth needed for improving those benchmark grades in both subjects. So key ethos that underpins our pupil premium strategy is this idea of quality teaching first. Okay, and this is founded based on the Sutton Trust in 2011, and quite strikingly, over a school year, pupils with quality teaching, pupils can gain an extra 1.5 years worth of learning. So it's quite significant, and it establishes the importance of implementing quality first teaching, especially for the disadvantaged. And I think if we look at the last sentence where it says for poor pupils, the difference between a good teacher and a bad teacher is a year's worth of learning. So it's quite a lot. So one way in which I find in which I maximize progression for the pupils that I work with is by modeling. And when I refer to modeling, I'm looking at, for the purpose of this talk, I'm looking at specifically writing. Pi Corbett in 2008 defined modeling as a teaching and learning strategies used by teachers to talk through their decision-making process. So modeling requires a lot of teacher talk. So modeling of writing requires a lot of teacher talk. And this can be quite daunting. I mean, when I first embarked on this journey of modeling writing in front of my pupils in the classroom, it was daunting from a perspective where I can write well and I have written well and I've demonstrated good writing in the past, but then to sit in front of 24 to 28 pupils in the classroom can be considered quite intimidating. So it does require a lot of teacher talk, and it also requires actually exemplary behaviour management. When I first did this, you know, I can tell stories where actually it became a car crash because the setup within the room wasn't exemplary. So it's really important. And I think modelling is also an important strategy for improving student writing and maximising impact. It's because the second bullet point, it's teachers are able to demonstrate a new concept. Now, our learners or our pupils, they've been writing throughout their whole school career, but there's a lot of poor writing within that, or weak writing, shall I say. If we think about the new concepts and using quotations, how often do we all see introduced quotations and people say a quote that shows this is? So the demonstration of new concepts through writing would be to teach pupils how to use embedded quotations to meet the assessment objectives. Again, it's those looking at writing strong thesis statements that meet AO1. Too often we see Priestley uses adjectives in an opening statement. So by modelling what a successful piece of writing looks like, we're able to demonstrate a new concept or a new way of writing. And I think the last one means a lot to me because modelling is defined as a way in which pupils are able to think about an answer to a question completely and concisely. And I think that's really important in allowing pupils to meet the assessment criteria or the writing criteria. As I said, I consider myself to be an expert writer in my classroom, and I'm not perfect. And I think by modelling writing with the use of a visualizer, students are able to see me correct errors, ensure grammar compliance, and use a range of sophisticated vocabulary. And I think that kind of demystifies the writing process. It makes it less intimidating. And I would make a case that this is just as important in Key Stage 3 as it is Key Stage 4, because if I find that if this is embedded well with Key Stage 3, it kind of leads to automaticity later on in the later years and promote that perceptive, judicious writing. So just to continue with why I use modelling, I find that modelling responses and use of academic language is a linchpin to successful writing. The best way to say this is, you know, if we think about how the nurses recently have been a linchpin to the NHS, modelling writing and modelling academic language is the linchpin to successful writing. I find the two are inseparable. You can't have one without the other. And if there's a focus on higher order vocabulary and placing a strong emphasis on the shape and form of a successful piece, students are able to really engage with this. I find that whilst I'm modelling, I often get pupils to write my piece in their own books in possibly a green pen so that they can become familiar with that. I find working with, my whole career, I've worked with disadvantaged children, and I find that when I give them a task like listed below, they often feel apprehensive and overwhelmed at the thought of writing. There seems to be a huge distance between how do I get from the task to completing the writing, and there's often these questions of how do I use those posh words? Writing like this is only for pupils in the top set. It's not for people like us. So by demystifying the rote writing process through modelling, they're able to access that kind of textual articulation. And most importantly, I find that modelling limits the number of low quality submissions that I receive from pupils. And it moves beyond that historic PEE, point evidence explain. I will make a case that there is a place for it. However, to achieve the higher boundaries or achieve the higher grades within writing, pupils need to move beyond that structural and procedural writing. And I think modelling quality response enables me to do so and address so that pupils can learn to address the AOs in a perceptive, judicious and creative form. Historically, modelling in my practice looked like this. It was less about sitting by the visualizer and acting out or performing or writing a piece, a response to a text. It was more of here's the task and here's one I did earlier. But I found recently that, as I said, there's still that distance. Pupils are still unable to see how I got from the question to the response. So I kind of moved away from using this in such a, well, I favoured using the live modelling as opposed to the model answer. I mean, the model answer is valuable, there's a place for it, but again, it's just the demystification of writing is allowed and afforded by using live modelling. So what do I use nowadays for modelling? Well, in my place of work, we have what we call the golden rules. Now, I don't know where the golden rules started. I don't know how they came about, but I absolutely love them. And I would have this, pupils know that when they're creating an analytical piece, these are the key features that will need to be included. Okay, so when I'm modelling, I am demonstrating that pupils need to make a clear point, moving beyond mentioning language techniques or structural features within the opening sentence, actually providing a strong thesis statement. Quotations is a big thing, and I mentioned that briefly earlier. So by modelling, I'm able to show pupils how quotations flow within sentences, not just spontaneous and introduced. They don't need a grand introduction. And so forth. But I do find that pupils are able to, the pupils have improved the quality of their responses, and this is the expectation for all students in Key Stage 3 and Key Stage 4. Yeah, so I just wanted to share that with you today, and that's, yeah, I hope that's helped. Right,
hey, Patrice, thank you. That was brilliant. That was very good. And we have questions for you. So let's get them going. First of all, a lot of teachers asking for recommendations on books or the reading that they can do to, you know, start doing modeling in their classes. Any recommended literature?
Books and reading. Sorry, it's relaxing now after
yeah, that's all right.
Going through that. So my mind's gone a bit blank. I'm not very good at questions.
That's basically, so I'm just gonna read the question out loud. Maybe I just didn't ask them, right? Are there any books or blogs specifically on good practice for modeling writing in English? That was the question.
When I first embarked on this journey, I was a fan of Andy Farby's work, and he mentions quite a lot about reading, about modelling writing in there. And Jenny Webb's books spoke about that too, and I found them quite useful. Yeah, so they're two that come to my mind. Yeah. Right now. Yeah, sorry, I'll make some notes on Twitter about books I have read, and there is a lot.
That'll be great. Yeah, just share them on.
Blank.
Yeah, just share them on Twitter later. That'll be great. Steph said that sometimes she struggles to think of how to write amazing pieces on the spot. So, do you prepare yours in advance, or do you just practice a lot and then you get good at doing it on the spot?
Yeah, I mean, as I said, when I remember trying this out first time, and I thought I could do it on the spot, and I actually find it quite intimidating and quite daunting. Yeah. So what I found myself doing is actually preparing the response beforehand, so that again it allows me not to be thinking on the spot so much, and I can better manage behavior if I've got my piece there. I mean, pupils don't know I have that piece there, and it can be considered cheating if you like, but it enables me to make sure that the writing I want my students to see has all the key features, meets the criteria, and it doesn't allow for I don't know, just a blank mind.
Yeah. And just following up from that, there was a question from Roberto asking if you model your thinking process as well with your students.
Yes, and I think that's an important part of modelling. That's quite an integral part to modelling my thinking process. So modelling why I'm choosing a particular adjective to zoom into, or why I've chosen to mention this part of the social and historical process. I think that's important, so that pupils can then have that same thought track when they are too writing.
Yeah, great. And how the question, I think, from Shona, how do you promote this level of complexity with the lower prior attainers?
Yes, and I think I feel more confident using this with lower prior attainers, because you just, again, it's about modelling grammar compliance. I think that's things they struggle with, spelling compliance. And with lower prior attainers, I've noticed the difference in terms of the work they have produced by seeing me practice and making this practice an integral part of a lesson. So it's not just, I don't model on an ad hoc basis. I try to, as much as possible, use this every lesson so that students are becoming familiar and possibly over familiar with how to write.
Yeah. Great. And I guess just more important for the moment right now, do you have any strategies for increasing student participation during lockdown? How are you doing the modeling during lockdown, distance learning?
We've moved towards Loom lessons, and I'm guessing that by using Loom lessons, it affords that time and space to model writing for pupils. It affords that time and space where you can record yourself going through the practices of writing and written articulation.
Yeah, sounds good. And just before we run out of time, a bit of advertising, I guess. People asking for recommendations on which visualizer to buy.
So I'm currently using the Ladybug visualizer. It's a red, it's quite small and it's quite discreet on the desk, and I find it's amazing. Click a button and it just works. There's no complications with it at all. So that's the Ladybug visualizer.
Yeah, sounds good. Okay, Patrice, thank you very much. That was great. Can you just tell everybody again how to get in touch with you, please?
Yeah, you're more than welcome to. If you have any further questions that I can probably better answer when I'm not feeling so nervous, just at me on Twitter at Patrice Miller _.
Yep. Great, thank you very much. And our next speaker is Kat Howard.
I've just done myself earlier. Thank you. Let me just share my screen.
No. Cancel.
Can you see that okay?
Yeah.
Brilliant, lovely. Hi everybody. There's so many people here that I'm so glad that Freya and Patrice went up first so I can gather my thoughts a little bit. Thank you, ladies, very much. Yeah, thanks so much for just coming along and listening to what we've all got to say. It's a little bit overwhelming, I think. So I'm Kat Howard. You can find me on Twitter at Miss. I'm assistant principal overseeing CPD and English at the Justin School in Northampton. I run Lit Drive, so I kind of deal with all that kind of thing. If you've not come across Lit Drive, it's a resource and CPD provision for English teachers, which is probably why it's worth mentioning. And last but not least, I'm author of Stop Talking About Wellbeing, and it's kind of with all of those different hats. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about curriculum and curriculum curation for all, and I'll kind of unpack what that means a little bit. I've got a book coming out with Claire Hill in September that kind of unpacks all of the thinking that I've been doing since last year when I kind of put Stop Talking About Wellbeing together. I originally wrote a couple of bits around curriculum and why it's so integral to our sense of purpose, and how actually a lot of the work that we do around curriculum is so interconnected with how we feel about going into work every day. And I kind of mulled that over for a little while and had loads of discussions with Claire and said, you know, this isn't working. I've just kind of sat all this writing in a pile and don't really know what to do with it. And we kind of unpacked it. And so it's led to where we are with the book coming out in September, which is really exciting. So I'm going to be talking to you about kind of the link between curriculum, particularly English curriculum, and why it's so important. And actually, irrespective as to your role within school, whether you are a classroom teacher, who you are one of the most integral parts to the curriculum, because you deliver all of that work, all of that hard work that's gone into the preparation, but how actually we all have this kind of professional duty to be thinking about curriculum, and it be, as I said, this really kind of, there's so much synergy between how we feel about work, generally how we feel as teachers, and the work that we carry out of the curriculum itself. So if I kind of unpack what I mean by the type, first of all, curriculum curation for all, these are the kind of key overarching questions that I'm going to be talking through to really unpack what I mean by that. So first of all, kind of explore what it does mean to curate the curriculum, and what I kind of mean by that question in itself, that statement in itself. Where we all feature, so as I say, kind of depending on your role within a school, how that kind of, what that looks like to you. Or what that looks like to me, and how I envisage that should look if we want to feel good about going into work every day. What questions, particularly as a subject lead or a specialist of your subject, which I would argue we all are kind of academic intellectuals of our subject, what we might need to think about, and then kind of practical strategies as to what we can do next. A lot of what I'm going to be talking about is English specific, because I think there's so much that when you're talking about curriculum that we need to kind of move away from that genericism and understand the underpinning principles of our subject in order to be able to talk about curriculum effectively. So what do I mean by curating the curriculum? I think that we sometimes and historically have talked about curriculum like it's something that we can crack and like it's something that we can finish. And I think that, and Mary Mike talks a great deal about this, about the curriculum never being done and the curriculum always being this ongoing continual process. And actually, from a standpoint as to if we're thinking about teacher purpose, that's really difficult for us to get our heads around, in the fact that the great deal of professions, you have an endpoint, you have these milestones, and with teaching, we don't have as much of that. And that includes the work that we carry out around the curriculum, because we essentially have this thing, this core purpose of working on curriculum and working on English curriculum, and you want to feel like you're making progress, but actually that progress is almost the work rather than the endpoint itself. So there is no endpoint with the curriculum, and I think a massive part of our role as English teachers is making our peace with that actually this is a process that we're going to come back to time and again, this process of refine and review, and you know, and making things better and improving over time, and being okay with that you're going to be working on curriculum until you retire is probably the biggest struggle that I think I've gone through over the last few years as a teacher, of kind of putting a curriculum map together and going, oh, the sense of satisfaction that that's done, I won't be able to do that, and it's making your peace with that, definitely. I think it's about understanding that curriculum does not equate to for the exam, and completely eradicating that language from the conversations that we have around curriculum is so important. I think that there's a great deal that has unfortunately historically been lost along the way from curriculum planning in schools as a result of, we need to do this for the specification, it doesn't appear in the final exam, we need to duplicate what the final exam looks like, when actually there's so many other ways that we can give students a really rich experience of our subject without having to even think about articulate, you know, what it looks like in the final product. Because as we all know, you know, if you're as passionate about English as I think majority of people that are here this morning are, there's so much more to English than a GCSE and coming out with a grade 4 or 5. You know, that's not what I want students in my classrooms to be remembering about my subject, about the fact that they did that question 3, that they really nailed it, and then when they got the exam they knew what to do. Of course there's a place for that, and that's important, but that's not what I teach English for. And so when I talk about curating the curriculum, I'm definitely not talking about that. I don't think it's skills-led. I don't necessarily feel that a skills-led curriculum has any longevity, that we have to work with our core and hinterland knowledge. If anybody wants to read more around that, Christine Council is very much your go-to. But with skills, if you're leading with a skills-led curriculum or skills progression, the issue that you then run into is that you're holding this kind of measuring stick up for students without actually having anything to measure it from. It's very, very difficult to measure a skill. We also know, like the skill in isolation, I mean, without knowledge to kind of hang it to. We also know that by using skills, we're almost setting students up to fail, because we all know those year 11 students that walked out of the school still not being able to analyse, still not being able to put an analytical paragraph together. And if anything, it's quite dissatisfying, both for a student and for yourselves as well, to go, okay, well, we're going to master skills actually, and it takes our attention away from the glorious knowledge of our subject, I think, overall. Last but not least, I think to talk about curation of the curriculum, and I'll talk about this later on around collaboration, we have to make our peace with the idea that it isn't owned, and kind of view our roles as teachers, as subject leaders, as something that the curriculum isn't a possession. It's not to be carried out by 1 or 2 key people within a faculty, within a department. It's the work of everybody, because it is all what we're coming into work to do. And so I think that, again, thinking to my experience and the conversations I've had around curriculum, this sense of ownership, this sense of curriculum as a possession, as 1 or 2 people's responsibilities. For example, you're Key Stage 3 lead, so you need to plan Key Stage 3. It's actually de-skilling faculty kind of staff as a whole. And ultimately, I think we have to go back to the idea that we are all designers of the curriculum, and I'll talk about that in a moment. So yeah, that's my next question. There we go. So where do I feature? If you're a senior leader, you are not an expert of the subject, so you're probably the person that's least involved in these conversations and thinking about what needs to be on the curriculum map for English. Your subject leaders need to be empowered to have those conversations, need to be empowered to make those decisions at subject level. So I view very much my role as a senior leader. Obviously I'm an English specialist, so it's a little bit easier if I'm managing English, but if you have a senior leader that's not an English specialist managing English, of course that can work, they can be asking the right questions, but their ultimate role is to create the right conditions for those subject leaders to feel really empowered to carry out that work. if you're a classroom teacher, again, it's coming back to what I said earlier, that you are essentially one of the most important components in that process, because all that preparation that goes into curating the curriculum, you're delivering it, you're trying to work out a way of translating our subject for those students. And actually that's a really, really important, vital component of carrying out the curriculum. I think we also have to think about, when we're thinking about the fact that everybody is designers of the curriculum, is how we're creating, again, I'll kind of give you a couple of practical examples of this later on, about how we are creating opportunities to create effective mental models for how to work collaboratively. So again, if I come back to previous departments that I know other people have worked within, where one or two people, and this is kind of on the back of a lot of conversations I've had recently around curriculum, is that it's not the what of the curriculum that sometimes we struggle with, but it's how do we collaborate, how do we make sure that it's not just one or two people, how do we create really effective mental models of decent conversations around curriculum, so that those NQTs or early careers teachers that are coming into a department see that in action, because they're our curriculum designers of the future. In 5 years' time, or however long, they're going to be sat strategically leading a subject. We need to make sure that those people are well equipped to have such conversations, to encourage collaborative action and collaborative work around curriculum. So that's really important. I interviewed Christine Council to stop talking about wellbeing last year, and I didn't use it, and I've hung on to some of that gold that I wanted to share with you today. So it's quite nice, because it's not from a book, it's actually a conversation that I had. So she said to me, your very being as a teacher from the word go should be thinking about what you're teaching. If you're not thinking about what you're teaching, then you can't be teaching well. You're just a conduit. That the stuff informs what you teach. How you pack a subject, how you shape it, how you really uncover and unpack a subject for children is fundamental. And so if you are, particularly early careers teachers, if you're coming into English, you know, congratulations if you're going to be an NQT this year, or you're in those early stages, do not think for a second that what you're thinking about, how you're thinking about what you're going to teach isn't important, because though your opinion and your academic accolade as such that you're bringing to that department is really valued. Otherwise, we're just sending people in to teach the stuff, and actually they need to be part of the process to prepare the stuff and what's come before they actually walk into the classroom. So it's really important, that process of symbiosis. So on the left hand side is everything kind of summarized, because I think I need it there to think about pitfalls. So why am I talking about this? Why am I not talking about what should be on your English curriculum, and I'm talking about how and why instead? Mainly because on the back of the curriculum CPD that I did a little while ago, this was the majority of my questions that kind of came through via DM and conversations that I had on the back of that curriculum. So a lot of people said, you really fired me up to think about my curriculum, to think about the diversity, or how it's a historical response to literature, and literature is a response to history, but I don't know how to do it for the setting that I'm in. We've got a head of department and they like to do everything, or we've got a Key Stage 3 lead and they plan all of Key Stage 3, and so it was the pitfalls that I wanted to kind of focus on. So various pitfalls. This isn't my job. There's a great deal of kind of in some departments around this idea of, well, that person does it. I think as well, curriculum planning for people, it is hard. It's really hard. And I think I learn all the time when I think about the curriculum. I'm constantly feeding off other people's ideas to inform me. And so it can be quite daunting. It can be quite overwhelming to think about the idea of putting curriculum planning together. And we need to make sure that we've got continuing professional development, again, which I'll come to later on, to support that. We can't just say we're all going to work on curriculum. There has to be the structures in place to do that. So I've not been trained to do this. I think that, and I'm guilty of this, my training didn't necessarily prepare me for curriculum planning, or thinking about the curriculum in the way that I would like, and the way that I feel provides a decent menu to the students I teach. I wasn't prepared for that at all. And so thinking about that 9 times out of 10, that gets in the way, it acts as a barrier for people. Other people will do this job more effectively, and I think, again, if we're thinking about how curriculum planning is carried out, yes, there is of course an argument that, you know, you want particular teachers to deliver areas that they have expertise in. If I have a Shakespeare expert, I'm going to want them to have an input in you know, planning for a unit on The Tempest, for example. But I also want those individuals that aren't as experienced to be in on those conversations, which is why collaboration is so key. And and I have other things that take priority. And this comes back to, I think it was Frey was saying about the role of the senior leader. You need to have the right conditions for this sort of collaboration, for this sort of synergy, for this sort of kind of work to take place. And so if it is the fact that you feel that your time is being taken by other things, that's probably what Stop Talking About Wellbeing is about. But you need to have a senior leadership team that that understand that the priority should be the curriculum, and that everything else pays servant and kind of, you know, pays service to that. But that's probably a talk for another day. So what questions should I consider if we're thinking more subject specific? Because it's, as I say, if we're thinking about kind of curriculum work as a whole, there's only so long that you can speak generically about kind of what that looks like before nailing it and kind of drilling down to our subject, English as a whole. So I'm going to talk through just, for those people that have kind of seen where I've talked about curriculum previously, this will ring some bells. And I've also kind of tapped into the wonderful Sally Stanton on this, maybe gave me lots to think about. So if we're thinking about curriculum curation overall, my left hand, yeah. I think it's coming back to that idea that it doesn't belong to anybody. It's not perfect, it's never going to be perfect. And we need to be quite ruthless when we're looking at curriculum. You need to create a culture in your department where nobody is precious about anything that is sat on that curriculum menu, because actually nothing is safe on a curriculum map. There's very few capsule pieces that we say that is going to stand the course forever and ever. So you have to make your peace with that before you go in and start picking things apart. And it is very much a critiquing process. So as you'll probably see, my two first questions there are slightly more critical than looking for the bits that work. I don't want to know about the bits that work, first of all. I want to know the bits that really don't work. So what's least connected? If you look at your curriculum map as a whole, what doesn't make any sense? What doesn't connect to anything? So if we're thinking conceptually, again, Mary's written a fantastic blog on this, and I know that she's spoken earlier this week, Mary Hine-Portley, that Freya shared. Where are your key concepts being threaded through the curriculum? Are you returning to, so for example, you're returning to the aspects of tragedy? Are you returning to the aspects of morality? Are you returning to gender representation throughout your Key Stage 3 to Key Stage 4 curriculum? What doesn't pay service to those concepts? I think and that's kind of along the lines of what's least useful. I think we, unfortunately, and again, I've listened to a lot of conversations around curriculum where you go, well, I don't really know why it's there, but it's always been there, and we really love teaching it, and the kids love it. So, and do you know what? It has to be, again, to quote Mary Meyer, it has to be useful and beautiful. You have to know the purpose that it serves, as well as the fact that it really provokes that curiosity. I'm not saying there's not a place for that, but I do think that anything on your curriculum has to serve both of those purposes. What is the heritage and ancestry of your curriculum? And Sally Stanton kind of plugged that question in there for me, of what's previously been disregarded. And that's a really important question, because if you're coming to a curriculum menu, if you're a new head of department and head of subject, head of key stage coming to the first time, it's really important that you understand the journey that your curriculum has been on to that point. Not necessarily because it will change or inform your decisions about what sits on the curriculum, but it will help you to understand maybe what's been included before that didn't work and didn't work for your context. So much of curriculum is context specific. It has to be right for your school at the time that your school, at the place that your school is in. For example, the curriculum work that we've done with Dustin now, I would argue with my knowledge of Dustin might not have been possible 4 or 5 years ago. It's very much a journey, and it's a response to that. It's also worth thinking about the heritage and ancestry of your curriculum as to who's put what together, because if you're having conversations about removing elements or making more of those links, it comes back to the how, it comes back to those conversations as to are you ripping out the same person's work? If you've had that previous issue around ownership of 1 or 2 people planning out the curriculum and putting all of that preparation together, is it just 1 or 2 people that you're going to cause that point of contention with? And you have to work out how to have those difficult conversations, but it's good to be informed about that as you're going. I also think as well, disregarded pieces, just to have a quick moment on that, is that sometimes units that have been put in your curriculum that didn't work, didn't not work, awful double negative. It's not that they didn't work because because they weren't fit for purpose. So for example, Merchant of Venice, delivering Merchant of Venice at year 9, it's been done before, it didn't work. It might not have been the fact that it was the text, but it might be the way that the text was taught, the way that it was put together. And so again, it's very much back to having those conversations around the table, making sure as a subject leader particularly that you're enabling, that you're creating opportunities for people to have those discussions, and that those discussions are healthy ones if we're thinking constantly about the how of the curriculum. Last but not least, once you've ripped everything out and thought really critically about your curriculum, what are your capsule pieces? What are the representatives of our subject? So if we're thinking Shakespeare, but what extent do they enable us to spotlight the contentious issues of our subject? And so we're not just talking about dead white men, but we're actually enabling diversity into our curriculum. We're not shying away from that. I think that's really important, and that we're presenting our subjects in such a way that we can have those contentious those conversations around contentious issues within society. I want my students to know about the suffragettes and how actually they, you know, the horrific mistreatment that they underwent in through force feeding in prison. I want my students to know that. I don't want to shy away from the fact that Medusa, you know, essentially was a victim rather than this terrifying Gorgon, and how much actually she wasn't to blame for her circumstance. I want my students to know that. I don't want to shy away from that. So think about how your curriculum serves to ask those questions and have those conversations. I also think, just before I kind of, sorry, I'm really going to power through this because I've squeezed so much in. I also think it's really important that we are mindful of cognitive bias. We all have our favourites when it comes to English and our favourite texts that we want to teach, and it's important that that doesn't get in the way of those questions. I'm guilty of that a lot. So if we're thinking about kind of collaboration, think about how many eyes are the work that you carry out around the curriculum passes over. So to what extent was that curation, or will that curation be a collaborative process? How many people are, I'll call it touching for want of a better word, how many people are touching those units as they pass through the quality assurance process, as we have those discussions, so that we can continue to refine and improve what we do over time? And that's not just necessarily the QA, the formal QA in schools when we're kind of looking over workbooks or looking over, you know, learning through being in the classroom and seeing that teacher enact the curriculum, but how many people saw that preparation process, and how can we enable opportunities to do that? As a quick example, so that I don't run massively over, how we've managed to do that and counter that remotely is that we've mapped everything, our entire curriculum out on a spreadsheet, worked out what the priorities were, worked out how to review everything across Key Stage 3, 4 and 5, which I'm really excited about. It's probably I feel like the best way that we could have used this time while we're sat working remotely. And each unit of work was put together by 1 or 2 people. So and the amazing work that has come through from some of our English teachers as a result of that collaboration, I'm incredibly excited about, and I've shared that with so many people this week. So it's just fantastic. It's really exciting. But also each unit is informally reviewed using agreed standards that we've put together, a 1-page document. It's on my blog, so that it's not the Key Stage lead, it's not anybody with any sort of agenda or motive about that they are accountable and responsible for that Key Stage, but it's just 2 other teachers having a discussion with you, a critical discussion with you about, well, why is that there, and why did you decide on that sequence, and why did you choose that particular text to teach that particular concept, and do you think that I've taught this before, do you think that would work better than that? And actually I've seen a really fantastic reading source on the British Library that might work well. We could, you know, chunk that down for Key Stage 3 and use a paragraph or 2 here, and having those fantastic subjects so that everybody gets to experience that process and everybody gets to see what everybody else is doing to improve the quality as we work. It's really interesting as a subject lead particularly, but I would argue, I'm going to come back to that, everybody is a designer of the curriculum argument, because I want you, if you're sat there as an NQT in 5 years, to be in a position to deliver a subject. I want you to be able to experience that along the way. To what extent could you teach all aspects of your curriculum? And I'll hold my hands up. I'm not a linguistics expert. I'm not a language expert. My key stage 3 lead, another teacher, I hope they're not here because I embarrass them, but they've put together this incredible gender and power unit as a result of being language experts and teaching language A-level. Having looked at that this week, it's really exciting, but it already makes me want to go away and read around what they've done and further reading to enable me to teach that particular unit. So think about to what extent you could teach all aspects of the curriculum that you've designed for yourself. And if there are areas that you do feel less confident with, then that's your priority. And where do you place yourself as a subject expert with the curriculum? So it's kind of one and the same. Okay, so what's next? What are you meant to do with all these big ideas and this information? I think about, and I'd argue that this isn't just for subject leads, but where are there opportunities for collaboration? And that's collaboration on a department level, and that's collaboration in the wider field. You have LitDrive, and I have, some 40+ regional advocates that will talk to you all day about literature if you'll let them via Twitter. If you go to the LitDrive page, you can see everybody that's a regional advocate on the extended team page. But where are you providing opportunities for not just you, but your team, if you're a subject lead, to have those conversations, to collaborate on ideas, so that we can have, as I say, many people touching our units, touching our curriculum as we continue on that journey. Where are you having conversations that ensures that we all understand that it's a contribution and not possession, that this view the curriculum as this kind of untamable monster? The curriculum is Caliban and we're trying to work with him and to not enslave him and put him back in a cage. But it's this idea that it doesn't belong to anybody, it's nobody's possession, nobody is kind of solely accountable. This is very much a collegiate process. I kind of talked about the power of collaborative networks. I would argue that if you lead on a GCSE, if you are looking to take a more active role as a participant within your faculty around curriculum, thinking about where those opportunities are to develop people within your teams. So subject-specific CPD, obviously I'm massively biased because of LitDrive, but subject-specific CPD needs to take place to enable people to feel confident and not daunted or intimidated by the concepts of curriculum planning. Not just because of the fact that we want amazing curriculums in our schools, but we want to keep people in teaching. That's really important. And this is I don't want to call it silver bullet, but this is the surefire way of us doing that, because ultimately it takes us back to our root purpose of what we came into teaching to do in the first place. So the book's out in September. It kind of talks around the various stages of curriculum, but that symbiosis between curriculum and classroom and how that can work, not just provide a really good menu for students, but to also provide a really kind of strong sense of purpose for you as well. So that's on Amazon pre-order at the moment. Thank you very much for listening. I ran slightly over. I'm so sorry. Let me just stop sharing.
Hey, Kat. No, thank you. That was right on time. No worries at all. Thank you very much. That was brilliant. And there are lots of questions for you. Okay. And then obviously we still have to announce something, right? Yeah. That's coming out today.
I can't wait till now because I haven't got anything to see.
No, let's just go through the questions first and then we do that.
Yeah, no
right.
problem.
So a few questions here. Practical questions. What time are you allocated for curriculum planning, both individually and as a department in your school?
So as a whole school, we really invest a lot of time. So actually it's increased meeting time, but meetings with purpose. So if there's nothing to talk about, we won't have a meeting for faculty, but it's an increase in faculty time with a real kind of focus on making sure that we have those conversations around curriculum and subject enrichment. So for English, particularly before I came to school, there was a particular focus on subject enrichment in those meetings. Next year, we've also handed over 12 hours of CPD time, of directed time, with subjects will kind of curate their own CPD in response to the needs of the faculty. So for example, we carry out a subject knowledge audit, or just have a conversation with your faculty. What is it that you need? What is it that you're not confident with? And then curate CPD to match that. It's really important, I think, to work alongside that the curriculum, you know, you could do all the work in the world in the curriculum, but if you're not carrying out CPD to support that, it's kind of fruitless.
Yep. And just talking about the department, if somebody has colleagues who are still very much clinging to teaching for the exam, how do you start a conversation with them?
Yeah, I think the issue is that there's so many different ways. I'd say arm yourself with knowledge. There's a great deal out there on the kind of impact of multiple choice questions and how incredible that can be for knowledge. If you read kind of Michael Young, Powerful Knowledge, or even, I'm just going to just read this book. And then what you do is you kind of highlight places, or you bookmark this book from Mary. You bookmark bits, and then you just leave it in people's pigeonholes, or photocopy bits and leave it in people's pigeonholes, and almost be like this kind of curriculum fiend, because there's so much more that we achieve great things at the exam by moving ourselves away from it's just for the exam. And Mary is much better at articulating that than I am.
I'm just going to say very quickly that next Thursday, Mary will be giving a Seneca webinar on Wednesday at 5 p.m. So if you want to come and listen to her speaking directly about that, just join on Eventbrite. Back to you now. There was a question from Becky. So you're talking about knowledge and skills. She's asking what really goes under each category in English.
Oh,
Why are you grouping?
Yeah, I don't really... I see skills, okay, to reframe that as practice. And as soon as you reframe that as practice, I think it makes a little bit more sense. So the knowledge of the subject, and again, Claire's written some incredible work around different areas of knowledge that we need to consider when we're thinking about curriculum. But the knowledge of our subject, so the core knowledge, the facts, the figures, terminology, and what Christine Council talks about as the hinterland, the stories that we use to teach that core knowledge. I don't necessarily see skills as skills. It's the practice. It's practicing applying that knowledge. So students being able to interpret that knowledge as their own through pieces of writing, through reading responses, through discussion. There's a great deal of kind of placing the merit on the thinking and not the doing. And that's how I kind of see things. That you've got that core knowledge, that terminology, the analytical verbs, evaluative verbs, all of that are the kind of tools that enable students to be able to articulate that knowledge for themselves.
Yeah, good. And there are two questions that are similar. So one of them was any advice for schools which are part of a MAT, and then they have a one-size-fits-all curriculum, so the school itself cannot really go against what the academy is saying. And sorry, just the second one is, what if your head of department is making all the decisions and not really talking to you classroom teachers about them?
Yeah, to kind of pick up on the first one, I think that there is a place for, for packaged curriculums and bespoke curriculums, and it sometimes fixes schools that are incredibly broken, where there's been nothing there. So I definitely think there's a place for that, and it's coming back to that journey. Where is your school on that journey to kind of mastering curriculum? You can't just kind of send people out and go talk about curriculum without training and thinking and unpacking and exploring what that looks like. So I would argue that there is a place for that, and maybe your school is on an earlier journey. With regards to the second one around kind of one person wants to, a good get around for that is just kind of asking to trial with your class. So trial maybe a particular approach, or using the same text but doing maybe something that you want to do with it, or drawing from some of the amazing resources that Freya shared, Common Lit, the academic reading to go alongside text. It actually links to particular text, Common Lit, so it's really handy. But just trialing with your particular class, I think, and once people see the success of that, it grows from there. I think that we need to move away from dogma of don't do that, do this, or don't do that, do this, and actually just build on what works. That's a much healthier approach, I think.
Yep. as a more direct question here from Salian, how do you feel about the complete segregation of the language and literature curriculum?
I think that they are two subject disciplines. I think that because so much of language relies on context and culture and our response to that, and I think that's much more fast moving than the world of literature, you know, particularly couldn't be more pertinent at the moment, our response through language and how interesting it is. So I do agree with this kind of sitting as two discrete disciplines. I think that it comes back to your concepts. Our concepts of the world are discovered through literature, and that's kind of where you can make those links for students, explicit links of, for example, the way that we kind of do it is these 4 overarching concepts of tragedy, morality, gender representation, and I'm going to struggle to think of the other one. I think it's other or segregation. It's something around segregation. But coming back to those concepts and actually finding texts that explore those concepts is a far richer experience for students to then make the link between the two. But I do agree that they do kind of sit as 2 separate entities.
Okay, yep, sounds good. And what about interleaved schemes? So linking reading and writing, do you use those concepts?
I think that interleaving in some examples can be done really well. I think that sometimes it's been misconceived and bastardized as being done really badly, where we're kind of jumping around from one text to the other. I think interleaving very much comes back to your retrieval, so constantly making those explicit links between, and if anybody watches kind of, it's science, but it's I think it's useful to see it in action. John Hutchinson did a talk that I think is on YouTube somewhere around this, about making it really explicit to students, those conceptual connections of where have we seen this before? What other character represents these ideas? What other character has represented this particular concept to us? Where have we seen a character struggle around morality and this idea of morality before? So if you're teaching Jekyll and Hyde, obviously it's really explicit to look at morality, and then you can tie that to, you know, Eric in Spectacles or any of the Berlings, about this fact that they struggle to see that they've done anything wrong, because for them it's about the legal sense and not the morality, not the moral sense of what they do. So I think it's about kind of approaching it in that way.
Yep, and there's a nice question here from Caitlin now. So if you were trying to go over the curriculum and just make changes, would you go and do each key stage at a time, or would you look at the bigger picture to try to have like a bigger plan in mind?
I think you have to look at the bigger picture, and I think that's what makes it really difficult. It's really hard because it's like it's a Rubik's cube, you know. It's this idea that if you touch one thing, if you take one thing out, then essentially, you know, you're pulling at all the threads of the other things. And so yeah, I would argue that even though it's far more difficult, and especially difficult to do collaboratively at the moment, it's worth the hard work to look at it as a picture of a whole, because if you're coming back to conceptual thinking, you need to make sure that those lines run through, of those, that we're coming back to the same ideas over and over again. We're just using different texts or different characters or different ideas to kind of to demonstrate them, and you need the whole curriculum in front of you to do that, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Last week on the geography conference, they kept calling it a 7-year journey.
Oh, so, yeah. Because science talk about the pillars. So yeah.
Yeah. So maybe I think it's the similar idea. There was a comment from Angela saying that A-level English has seen lower numbers recently. So she wanted to know if you have any thoughts on that.
I think it just comes back to unfortunately, I think when the specifications changed for GCSE, naturally, some people panicked and we reverted back to, and that's what we do. And you see this in the current climate as well, that we've all started talking about recovery curriculum and what recovery curriculum can look like, when actually recovery curriculum is just teaching really, really well and doing what we do best. And I think that we maybe reverted back to that panic of we need to make sure that we're getting the grades, because we don't know what the grades will look like. We don't know what a 4 or a 5 is. And so we reverted back to that. And I think that now we're seeing the knock-on effect of that, the impact of that through our A-level numbers, because as a student you're not going to be motivated alone. It's that intrinsic motivation that you need to be interested in a subject beyond getting a grade for it.
Yeah. And I'm just going to follow up with Ruth's question here. She just asked, so she works in a 11 to 16 school, So how do you work with them if you don't know what kind of text they're going to study when they move on to A levels?
Oh, okay. When they're moving on to A level,
Yeah.
I think the key concepts of literature and what we aim to do with literature, to not to get too grand about it, is very much the same. And so yes, there's a place to look at the mechanics and the specifications, but actually, if you think about literature as an art form, we're exploring those same big concepts all the way through. So if you're doing that, and if you're mindful of that when you're putting your curriculum together, I think as a natural evolution of that, you will prepare them for the next steps. You cannot deliver a world-class curriculum and fail those students to enable them to prepare later on. I think that's a natural almost side effect of what you're doing, by creating a really meaningful, engaging, exciting, diverse curriculum that looks at those big ideas in society.
Last question, because we're out of time. What are your absolute key concepts?
Yeah, I think it comes back to, if you just think about this, what you want students to understand about society around them. So it comes back to, for me, it's gender. Gender has to be an issue there. Diversity, or segregation, or other, or difference. I think there's so many interesting conversations to have around the way that literature has handled that through time. Morality and legality and crime and punishment. Again, I think that there's definitely a place for that. I also think that we need to focus on, for ourselves, for our own CPD, is this presence of biblical allusion, and coming back to understanding how the Bible actually has influenced so much of what is present within our curriculum. I think that's a really good starting point. If you're a classroom teacher, get to grips with the biblical allusions, because that will present those key ideas and give you such an informed understanding of those in order to teach, I think.
Yep, amazing. So thank you very much, Kat. That was fantastic. Just gonna let people know now that Kat has a free, just launched this morning, a free CPD course based on her book, Stop Talking About Wellbeing. Do you want to tell people a bit more about what the book's about and what the course will cover?
Thank you. So it's just, I think it's very pertinent as well, because the segment of the book, so Stop Talking About Wellbeing, was thinking about taking a pragmatic approach to workload reduction instead of cake Fridays and yoga on a Thursday, and thinking about how we can structurally and individually improve our workload and our sense of purpose as a result. Seneca have taken, probably the most pertinent for this talk, the conversations and communications part of that book, and turned it into a leadership course, which is absolutely fantastic. And so if we're thinking about the hows and the conversations, especially how we manage to do that, so there's a segment on email in there, which I think is quite pertinent. Then go check it out. But it's really exciting.
Amazing, great. So that's the big announcement that we just wanted to share with you today. There's this free CPD course based on Kat's book that is available on Seneca Learning. I just shared the link on the chat. I'm going to share that on Twitter as well. So go for it, and you even get a certificate at the end. So brilliant. Thank you very much, Kat, again.
Thank you.
We're going to go for a break now, and then we'll be back at 11:20 with Mark's talk. So please be back at 11:20, everybody. See you soon. Okay. Hi, everybody. Hope you're back. That was the end of the break. So I do hope everybody's back. So we can start the second half of our conference. And I just want to tell you the hashtag Seneca CPG is trending #2 on Twitter. So that's brilliant. Well done. Good job. That is amazing. Thank you to all of our previous speakers, and already thank you to the upcoming ones, because this is really, really great. So, and also I just shared the link to a blog post that has then the link to Kat's CPG course, okay? So that's how this works. And now our talk is from Mark. Mark, are you there?
Yes, I am. I'm just about to share my screen now.
Brilliant. Yeah, go for it. Thank you very much. Yep.
Okay, that fine? Everyone see that okay?
Yes, that's working.
Brilliant. Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Mark Roberts, and today I'm going to be talking to you about this annoying phrase that you will have heard many times, I'm sure, come out of students' lips, that you can't really revise for GCSE English. And this is going to be something that you're going to hear many times throughout your career if you're a trainee or a new teacher, and it's something that I think is holding back many students from reaching their true potential. This annoying misconception that English is somehow special as a subject that impedes revision. Just going to briefly tell you a little bit about myself to begin with. In my day job, I'm an 11 to 18 comprehensive mixed school in West Devon teacher in there. So I'm an English teacher. I also work as an assistant principal, leading on CPD, teaching, learning and research. But when I'm away from school, I do quite a lot of writing. So I'm the co-author with Matt Pinkett of Boys Don't Try, Rethinking Masculinity in Schools. I write frequently for The Tests and eMag, which is a brilliant magazine for A-level English language and literature students. In my test columns, I try to make sure I chuck lots of English subject knowledge in whenever I can. And as well as that, I've also written the introduction to a couple of the Collins Classic set text series, which has been brilliant, because one thing that I've tried to do throughout my career is just keep on working on my English subject knowledge. And I'm talking to you about English today and trying to give you a few ideas and a bit of expertise, but I just keep on working on it. And I don't think there'll ever be a stage like what Kat was saying about the curriculum's never done. I don't think there's ever going to be a stage where I'm going to say, okay, I've got Romeo and Juliet nailed. I've written an introduction on it, and there's still parts of the text where I think, okay, I can probably teach that better next year. So that's going to be something that will sustain me, and hopefully there'll be a few things that you'll pick up today that will help you deal with this idea. Now, the key elements of this talk are based on my book, which is coming out. Well, it's coming out soon, actually, isn't it? It's available for pre-order now, and it's called You Can't Revise GCSE English. Ironic title, Yes You Can, and it's aimed at students. And the idea is that it's moving away from the traditional revision guide that talks to you about the what you need to know. And this is really how, and it offers a step-by-step approach to the entire revision process. But I think that many of you would be interested in it, and English teachers who've taken a look at it so far have said to me that it's something that they want to buy, because it does offer this assistance when you get these kind of ideas from students about what can I do to revise English. So if you look at the contents, we look at things like how to memorize quotes, which quotes are the most important ones to focus on, looking at things like the unseen extracts from GCSE language. So it's not just focusing on literature. It's got things like unseen poetry, which tends to be a real concern for even the most confident students, and also looking at what you can do to pre-prepare ideas for the creative writing questions as well. So hopefully at the end of this talk, you'll want to take a look at it and let me know how you get on with it if you do get a copy. So this is going to be what I'm going to focus on. I know that you know that students can revise for GCSE English, that this annoying myth is just that. But what does that look like in practice? I'm only going to be able to give you a flavour of it today, and we don't have time to go into every element of the revision process. I'm just going to talk about 5 key areas. And as I go through, I'm going to show you a few things, and you probably want to go back and have a look at the recording if you want to look at some of the examples in a bit more detail, because I will inevitably have to kind of rush through a few things. So the 5 key steps that we're going to focus on when we're looking at GCSE English success is understanding the idea of revision and how we're going to communicate that to our students, looking at effective strategies like retrieval and spaced practice, how we as teachers can make sure that we're modelling each stage of the revision process, thinking about this idea of pre-preparing content, which is a big theme of the book and a big feature of my teaching. And then finally, I'll just have a quick word with you about keeping their motivation levels up, which is always trickier when they've got 8, 9, 10 plus GCSEs to focus on as well. All right, so first of all, I think that as English teachers, we need to be really careful around our language when we're talking about revision. Traditionally, revision was always seen as something that was done towards the end of the course, you know, revising from February onwards or whatever it may be, or as they approach an end of assessment unit or their mock exams or whatever. I think we're going to be really careful and make it clear that revision is something that takes place from day one, from lesson 1, whether you start your GCSEs in year 9 or year 10, that you are setting them work, you're setting them homework that's going to be saying this is part of your ongoing revision process. And the emphasis is going to be frequent bursts of revision, little and often throughout the course. It needs to be interweaved and spaced, and we have to be really careful about how we set homework and also how we set things up during lessons to ensure that this is not just something that they see as work that's done at home, where you just go over stuff that you've done over the course. It's not just going back and making sure you've learned stuff, it's being able to apply that previously learned material to new topics. And this is absolutely key. So as teachers, we've got to set them up for revision, for effective revision, but it comes from the messages that we give as well. So what might this look like in practice? Well, the research tells us that most students take really rubbish notes. And I was teaching a year 12 student for EPQ last year. She'd got a couple of grade 9s in English, so she was really bright, but she didn't have a clue how to annotate these journals that I'd given her to read. And we spent one whole lesson where I sat down and showed her, this is how I annotate. These are the notes that I make when I'm reading journal and criticism and so on. And that was something that was like a revelation to her. No one had ever shown her how to do this before. So we cannot make those assumptions that students will know how to do something which to us is just as simple as taking notes. And some of you today will be trying to take notes as I'm talking, and we've got to forget that there are real difficulties, even for experts, in taking notes. If I suddenly start speaking really quickly and going through things very speedily and rushing on, you're going to be like, whoa, slow down. And we have to be really careful thinking about the inherent difficulty of note-taking at times and some of the mistakes that our students can make unless we're very specific in the language. Make a note of this. This is really important. This is a key idea that I want you to take down. Things like that. So many teachers have come on the idea that showing students how to spell notes is an effective strategy, and it is. And in the book, I spend a lot of time going through and showing them the step-by-step guide to being able to use Cornell notes. And it leads up to examples such as this, where students are using questions as a prompt to be able to then go on and have more detailed, useful notes as summaries that they can go back and look at when they're revising. And if you look at the bits in red, those are summary parts, and it's helpful to try to get them to use a different colour for that reason, so that they can go back and skim and pick out the key ideas. And that's great. But one thing that I look at in the book is a technique that one of my previous students, Molly Baldwin, who is now studying English at Cambridge University, that she uses Cornell notes, not just for when she's taking notes during lessons or anything. She uses them for handouts, for textbooks and so on, so that there's this really systematic approach to making sure that everything is building towards being able to have organised, helpful notes for revision, whatever you're reading. So say, for example, you give your students some critical reading. This is an example on my last book that's taken from the Power Foundation, and they read through it, and previously they might online a couple of words and they're not really sure what it is they're going for. If you use the Cornell note system during lessons while you're doing this and using them to do this at any time, you start to get far more effective notes. If you look at those kind of things, we've got a couple of key questions there about the form and about the key symbolism behind the poem, and it enables them to really pick out what is the key aspect of this critical reading that I'm doing, and how can I then start to incorporate this into my own ideas. We also know from the research that most students use ineffective study techniques. So they like to cling to their highlighters. They like to feel that this illusion of fluency where they're rereading notes because it feels more comfortable than testing themselves. And most students like to leave it until too late and try to cram for exams. I was reading something recently which said that the average amount of time that some students spend on exams is 4 hours of revision. Now that's truly terrifying, isn't it? So we've got to make sure that for those kind of students, we're building these techniques into our lessons. So I know that lots of you will have already used retrieval and space practice within your lessons, and will have spoken to students about the benefits of using these techniques, which show this real high utility, this high effectiveness. And that's great. There's a big problem that I'm looking into recently shows that even when
Mark,
you speak to your students, yes, sorry.
Hi, sorry, your sound is going a bit off. Don't know if it's internet connection, but can you try switching off your video so there's only sound coming? I think that should probably make it a bit better.
Yeah, no problem, I can do that.
Sorry about the interruption, but we want to hear what you're saying.
No problem at all.
And everybody else, please switch off your videos as well. Okay, everybody.
Okay, right,
okay,
is that better?
Yeah, that sounds better, yeah.
Okay, great. So I was just saying that despite the fact that lots of teachers spend time teaching their students about the benefits of retrieval and space practice, there's recent research that shows that even when students are aware of this, they still end up falling into these bad habits and going back to the study techniques that are seen as easier and more comfortable to them. So that's something that happens. And it's particularly true of boys, that towards the end of the course, if they've left their revision until too late, they start to then abandon these effective study techniques and start to revert to the ones that they've been told not to use. So this is something that we've got to absolutely guard against. So how can we do this? We need to make sure that these techniques are fully integrated into our lessons and in the homework that we set. So that leads us on to the second part of today's talk, using effective retrieval and space practice in lessons and during homework. Well, we know that quizzes and multiple choice questions are really effective. Kat was talking about that earlier, and we know this, and that's fine. I'm not going to spend time going over that again. I'm just going to talk you through a few of my favorites that I've used over time. Single word quotations is something that I stumbled upon. I think I was late after one hectic playground duty at break time. I came back in and my class were waiting for me. And I was like, okay, nothing planned, nothing ready. I've not got the time to load up my PowerPoint. What I'm going to do? So I just wrote down some words off the top of my head that were from some of the key quotes from some of the texts that we've been studying. So you can see on the screen there, this is not my to-do list for this evening. This is some words that are taken from actual quotes from actual literature texts. So if we go and have a look at these, you well done if you spotted any of these. They're taken from the Power and Conflict anthology for AQA. And then there's a Jekyll and Hyde, a Romeo and Juliet, and a DNA quote there. And these become really useful because what you can start to do is to use nice little themes like I had there, or you can make sure that they're all starting with the same letter, or they're all using powerful verbs, or best of all, and I give some examples in the book of this, is using words. So for example, blood or bloody, that come from multiple texts, and it forces students to make links between those texts and to think about these kind of high utility words that they can think about, or words that are featured as motifs within the same text, for example, are really useful too. And just to create that nice extra layer of desirable difficulty, I also will pick out the less obvious words from some famous quotes. So think of a plague on both your houses from Romeo and Juliet. You might give them both rather than houses or plague and see if they can come up with it then. And it's something that students can then start to do as part of their own revision, and it enables them to go back and ensure that they've learned some of these best quotes. Odd one out is another nice one when it comes to looking at comparing and thinking a bit more laterally about ideas about which character is the different one, or which particular scene is different. And the beauty about these ones is there's not always one right answer, that it might be that different students can come up with different reasons why they stand out. So it creates lots of really interesting discussion that can be a springboard into more detailed discussion for later on in the lesson. Some of you will have seen these kind of starter for 5 activities, which are brilliant because it ensures that you're thinking about students' work being interweaved and spaced, so that you're going back and covering things that you're not just studying at the moment, things that you've not done for a while as well. And it's really important that we model that going back over and making it part of each lesson that we're going to be looking at different texts. One key thing to point out actually is if you're asking students to answer this 4 key quotes from Sing Song, for example, and if I were to say to someone, can you give me a quote, and then someone else, can you give me a quote, I'm not stretching them in the same way, and it can give you this illusion that students have got the right answers. I need to be saying to the same individual, can you give me 4 quotes, to make sure that they don't just have one and they don't just have this surface knowledge. So be careful in your questioning when you're doing that. But increasingly, my favorite way of using retrieval practice is to move away from just using it as memorizing of key facts and plot and ideas, and really focusing on to deeper thinking and setting up the kind of statements that will allow students to really go into more complex ideas. So I usually give them these kind of statements, which are usually quite definite, and then in our discussions with the students, they can unpack some of the ambiguities that are there, and we can find a few more nuanced ideas. The second one was based on a little discussion that I had on Twitter the other day with Chris Curtis about whether, when the prince banishes Romeo, is this just a plot device, or is there some more symbolic meaning beneath it? So these kind of things will allow students to then go on and start tackling essay questions with these kind of really interesting retrieval ideas there in the background. So when we get on to the third stage, we've already had from Patrice this really excellent explanation of why live modelling is key. It's absolutely important, though, that we don't just use live modelling for doing paragraphs and essay questions and exam questions and so on, and that we're modelling each stage of the process. So I talked earlier about showing my student how to take notes, and that's something now I do with all my classes. I don't make assumptions that they can annotate effectively. We show them how to make flashcards and how to use them. We pick out the most important quotations. I show the mistakes that can happen with context and then how to avoid them. And I also make sure that I'm doing what Patrice showed beautifully earlier, this idea of drafting and redrafting with my creative writing. So what might this look like? In the book, I spent a chapter where we look at some of these killer quotes, some of these absolutely essential quotes, and try to narrow it down to the top 5 quotations in each of the texts. And by doing this, you can say, okay, well, you've got a paragraph that's prepared for this one particular quotation on a particular question. Can you make it fit a different exam question? Can you make it fit this exam question? Can you make it fit one that it doesn't seem to fit with? Does it still apply? So this is really good practice in classroom and at home as part of their revision. Context is an area that even with my most confident students, they sometimes get the balance wrong. And this is from my experience and from the exam board feedback. And I use this in a lot more detail in the book. These are the things that can go wrong. So it's really important that I spend a lot of time modeling around that. And this was an example of the kinds of vague generalized context that I noticed from my year 11 class a couple of years ago after their mock exams. And they were making very generalized comments that weren't particularly adept at showing their deeper thinking about the times and the text. So I introduced them to some more nuanced critical ideas, and then gave them my model. And I've broken it down to you into stages. So we have the initial statement, then we get the close language analysis, and then this is the key bit that they were getting wrong, that we really look about how we can have more advanced ideas about context. And I know you've not got time to look at that in detail, and you can go back to that now, but it really did make a difference, the fact that I'd give them this model and encourage them to avoid these kind of wide generalizations that they were making about historical ideas. And this leads on to I suppose what is the key theme that runs throughout the book, this idea that I want my students, and I've said this flippantly before, that only fools really go into exams not having an idea about what they're going to write. And for me, I want my students to have a really good idea about, this is my strength, this is my area where I really know my stuff, and I'm going to take the question on and make the question fit my paragraphs. Now that done badly can be disastrous, so you've got to model it relentlessly. You've got to show how you can skillfully do this, and this is a key thing that I do. And for me, I'm absolutely key on some of the stuff that's been mentioned before about allusions. Biblical allusions that Kat mentioned was key as well. But for me, having these pre-prepared sentences that I've picked out, and I'm going to adapt them to fit either in non-fiction or in my fiction writing. I'm going to use these sentences to show off a bit. So this is a famous line that's an opening to a particular text. Some of you might recognize this. Well done if you spotted that it's a George Orwell essay, and he's writing about these German bombers that are kind of flying around, circling overhead, and he's worried that he's going to get bombs dropped on him. And I adapted this for a piece of my own writing for an article that I wrote for the test that was about line managing the maths faculty. And I adapted it, and I was really pleased with myself with this clever allusion. And then, of course, the sub-editor got their hands on it and totally mangled it. But never mind, I'm not bitter about that. But it did give me a useful way in for my students. And this is an example of something that one of my students wrote based on this model. And the key thing is my student became really confident that he could use this model regardless of whatever topic might come up for the narrative or for the transactional writing or so on. But it's not just about sentences. I think you can go further and you can model these pre-prepared structures and paragraphs. And I'm going to show you an example that I love to use that would be perfect for transactional writing. And I call it the flipped circular structure. So we start off with the creative opening. Now, normally, when you're writing to argue, the expectation is you just do a straightforward argument. You get straight into your kind of statistics and your anecdotes or whatever it may be. I don't do that. I encourage my students to start with this little mini story. It's a narrative that sets the scene in an exaggerated, satirical way that makes the reader think, why are they telling me a story? They're meant to be doing a straightforward argument. And this is the kind of question you might apply to AQA, often use these kind of prompts. And this would be the kind of mini story that I would tell to begin with. And you'll notice there that it's got a couple of allusions when you go back and look at it in a bit more detail. In between, you do all your normal argument, you do a few paragraphs of that, and then you come back at the end and you use the same sentence structures, almost the same words, except you twist it from a positive to a negative or from a negative to a positive, whatever way you want to take it. And this is something that my students were now going into exams thinking, okay, I've got this structure. I know pretty much what I'm going to do based on whatever question comes up. And it really is quite liberating for them. So the final thing, and I'm running out of time, is just to say, in terms of keeping them motivated, how can we use language as an English teacher to keep them want to engage with this revision process over the case of 2 or 3 years or however long your GCSE is? We know from the research into motivation that telling them to do their best, to work hard, to crack on with it and to try isn't enough in itself. It has to be more specific than that. You can't just give them feedback saying you need to do more revision. You've got to be very precise about what that looks like. So for me, the emphasis is on mastery over performance in terms of their goals. And what does that mean in reality? We have to make sure that whenever we give in feedback and in the way that we speak to students after assessments and so on, that we're talking about failure as part of the learning process. It's an integral part of the learning process. Ignore the grade, ignore the marks, don't speak about the numbers unless you absolutely have to, and instead focus on what can you do to make this a bit better. And if they can set those specific and challenging goals with your guidance, that's all the more better. Because for me, the emphasis has got to be on this competition as a form of competing with your past self, this focus on continual gradual improvement. So what might that look like? You might say, okay, well, let's have a look at your exercise book. Your introductions in September were pretty poor. Let's have a look at them now in January. Yeah, they're far more convincing, far more impressive. Just imagine how good they're going to be by the time you get to the exams in May or June. And that's the kind of language and the kind of talk that I think will keep them motivated, will keep them tasting success and want to do more, rather than trying to say, you got a 4 last time, if you work hard, you can get a 5 next time. So that's me done. One final plug for the book. It's out on the 25th of June, but you can, and I'd love you to pre-order it now. Okay, thank you very much. I'd love to take some questions.
Hey, Mark, thank you very much. That was great. And the sound was very good after you switch off the video. So can you stop sharing the screen and switch the video back on, please, so we can see you?
Okay. Okay.
Yeah. Oh, it does says your network bandwidth is low, so I guess that was, but it's working now, so it's good. Cool. So we have a few questions. Before I start with the questions about the talk itself, there were some questions about your book. So if you can tell more about the book, is it aimed at students? Is it aimed at teachers? Does it work for all exam boards, or is it focused on a specific one?
Yeah, of course. It's aimed at students, but I think that teachers will find it very useful. And some of the English teachers that have looked at it have said to me, I'm going to buy this as an English teacher. I'm going to buy it for the department as an English teacher. But it is aimed at students as a revision guide. But as I say, it's different. Most revision guides are, this is the stuff you need to know. Whereas this looks at the how in a real step-by-step stage, taking the student who really struggles to start with revision, at this, hopefully ideally at the start of the GCSE course, and takes them all the way through to the more complex ideas towards the end, such as rewriting, improving essays and creative writing. So yes, that's the key emphasis on the book.
Yeah, okay, good. And so there were questions right in the beginning about note taking, whether you advise only linear note taking, or do you also like mind maps and more visual notes for students?
Yeah, I think you can do that within the Cornell notes. So I showed it just tended to be quite straightforward sentences and prose, but there's no reason why diagrams and mind maps can't be part of that. The key part from the research that I've done into Cornell notes is that the statement, or ideally the question, is the key prompt. So if I had a question that would say something like, what are some of the key themes in Macbeth? And then the response to that was a mind map with those key themes from it, that's absolutely fine.
Yeah, okay, good. Some questions about pre-prepared responses. So there was one on, do you think that they can limit higher ability students or higher achievement students? And the other one, how do you actually recommend preparing them? That was more, but the chat's going on too fast. So
yeah, no, pre-prepared is always a bit controversial. The exam boards don't like it, and it's one that's not for the purest of the English teachers. But I actually think that if it's done properly and you model each stage of it, far from being limiting for the top students, it's actually something that's liberating and stretches them and challenges them. So the idea of pre-preparing, I think, is this sense of, these are the elements that I'm particularly interested in, that I'm particularly fascinated in, that I'm particularly good at analysing. So to go back to those statements that are in terms of the retrieval practice, and using those as a way to think about how can we adapt those and make them fit a question that might not on the surface seem to be about that particular quotation. So far from saying, okay, I'm only going to allow you to write about this, I think it allows you to look at all the themes and all the ideas, but with the comfort of knowing that you've already got something interesting to say about it. And that's where the emphasis for me for pre-prepared comes from. Interestingly, not long back, I was reading Stephen Fry's second autobiography, and he pretty much got through all of his Cambridge exams by doing pre-prepared responses. So I don't think it's something that you can't do if you're clever. I think it has to be done carefully, but you have to spend a lot of time adapting it. So you'll give them a question, they'll write an essay, and then a week later you'll say, okay, I want you to use the best bits from that essay, but for a totally different question. Let's see whether you can do that or not. So it requires adapting and a bit of amending as you go, but they really need to know their stuff to be able to do it. It's not a quick, easy approach.
Mm-hmm. Yep. What about when you talked about statements for deep thinking? There was a question from Abby asking if they are oral or written or both. How do they actually work in the classroom?
Yeah, so what I tend to do is I'll give them, say, 5 minutes and put 3 statements up on the board, and they can either formulate a response where they write it down, they can make notes, or they can just have an oral response. But every pupil in the class has to be prepared for the fact that I'm going to call on them at some point. And I will do things like, okay, Stephen's given me this response. Paul, what do you think? Do you agree? Do you disagree? So we get a bit of a debate going from it, but I'm happy for them to write it down.
Yep. And there was a question from Kelly saying that you were talking about introductions and conclusions, but there seems to be very little reward for these in exam conditions. So how do you reconcile that in the classroom?
I disagree if they're done well. I think most introductions and conclusions get ignored by examiners because they're just kind of waffly fluff that's filling a bit of time and easing their way into it. If you look at some of the most effective introductions, they set out a step-by-step guide to the entire essay, and it's almost like an essay plan in brief. And if you look at some of the examples that I do in the book, I think that they're really setting the stall out where they're introducing complex ideas and complex themes. The conclusion is a bit of a bonus, isn't it? Sometimes you don't have the time to do it, but I just use a couple of key sentences as a way of wrapping things up. But again, it really does add to the overall experience of the essay. And I think that the examples I show in the book would definitely pick up marks.
Yep, good. And yeah, so a question, didn't catch the name of the person, sorry, on students struggling to have their own viewpoint and perspective on an essay question. So how do you help them with that?
To begin with, you give them your viewpoint,
okay,
and you get them to take that, and that's absolutely fine because you're an expert. And then over time, you might start to say, well, what about this? And I think it's just something that can be very gradual. But there's nothing wrong where if you've got a student who is really stuck to say, okay, use my idea, like Patrice was showing earlier, copy down my paragraph. I'll give you a different quotation and see if you can adapt my paragraph for this quotation. There's nothing wrong with them taking your idea as long as they're reformulating it in their own words. Over time, they get more confident. They've got the knowledge as a springboard. They might start to experiment a bit more.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And there was a question from Jane here. How do to the whole chat, but also to you. How do you feel about students writing first person in analytical writing? She said she was taught not to use it, but she wants to know if that's changed recently or that's still the advice.
Yeah, I tend to not model that. I don't find that those personal responses tend to work very successfully. You get the odd one that does and the odd example that stands out, but largely the emphasis is using more formal academic, that sense of different distance, that sense of objectivity is wiser, I would argue.
Yeah. And just going back to pre-prepared responses, there was a question asking about what are they? Are they whole piece of creative writing? Because that's what they do in their school. So is that something that you would advise?
Yeah, it varies. I've had certain students who will plan, say, 2 or 3 whole pieces of creative writing, and then we'll make whichever one is most applicable to the task that's given, which are usually quite general. That will be used as their piece. Or others might just have little key paragraphs and they think this paragraph is going to go in there. Or it might even be they've just got a sentence like the illusion that I showed at the start, the George Orwell one. It might just be, okay, that's going to be my opening. It depends how confident these students are. Some people see this as a kind of a shortcut, as a bit of a cheat. But bear in mind, a student that's memorized a full 2-page, highly skilled creative writing piece that picks up lots of marks, that's very useful for them in the future. That's not a shortcut. They've had to work really, really hard on that. So I don't see that as being something that's a problem, even though I know it upsets some of the purists.
Yeah, good. And more practical question from Emily. How do you have time to embed sentence modeling consistently? She says she tried during the FA language, but didn't really get to do it because there was not enough time.
I think it's so important that you have to make the time. I really do believe, Patrice said earlier about doing it every lesson. And for me, what could be more important in terms of teaching writing than showing them how to construct sentences? And if you move away from the kind of a forest approach where it becomes a tick list or so on, you have time, you find time, and you can look at beautiful sentences from the literature text and just think, okay, let's have a go at adapting that for a piece of our own writing, things like that. The time is there if you prioritize it over other activities that aren't as necessary, I would argue.
Yeah, and I have 2 minutes left, so one more question. There was actually a lot of comments about Socratic learning, so I just want to know your views on that and your thoughts on that.
In terms of when we're questioning students, I think that it's very important. I'm really looking forward to the talk that's coming up on Socratic learning. And it is something that I have used with my students. But I think personally for me, the key element of my classroom after the initial discussions is lots of written practice. So very much using the I, we, you approach, which I know many will be familiar with, so that I will model something, I will get them to work on it under my support and guidance, and spending a lot of time going back and addressing those misconceptions, but then giving them lots of opportunity to answer questions independently. That tends to be the key element of my teaching, but I'm fascinated when teachers do use Socratic techniques and do them really well.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Mark. That was great. That was excellent. Can you tell people again how to buy your book? Because there are lots of questions on how do I get that book.
Yeah, so it's available on Amazon. So it's called You Can't Revise for GCSE English. Yes, you can, and Mark Roberts shows you how. If you don't like buying off Amazon, you can get it from the Collins website, so the Collins secondary website. And as I say, it's available for pre-order, and it will be out within the next, I think, in 12 days' time. So yeah, very much looking forward to that.
Brilliant, fantastic. And I just want to remind everybody who doesn't know Seneca yet that our whole point is to give revision tools to students. So in addition to everything that you do in the classroom, there is a free revision tool used by 3 million people already available for you, covering, I think, 25 different texts, GCSE and A-level. So just go for it and give it a try. Thank you very much, Mark.
Brilliant, thank you. Thanks, everyone.
Next one is Yamina. You there?
Hi everyone. I can't help it. I just want to do a double wave all the time, every day. I don't know why. I'm so sorry.
Great. So just go for it. You can share your screen and start.
Can you see that?
Not yet. Yes.
Hi everybody, I'm Yamina VP and I'm an assistant head teacher leading English in a school in East London. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about my career journey. So about 2 weeks ago, I got the responsibility of leading English, and it's been an exciting journey already. Before that, I was a lead practitioner, and I'm an accredited lead practitioner with the SSAT, and I've been doing that for 5 years before that. And I've had a number of roles within the English department and outside of it, but my real love is English, and it's always been my passion. So I'm really excited to be here. And I'm going to be talking about something that is actually a huge topic, but I've got 10 minutes to do that. So you'll have to bear with me. I will try and slow down my talk, but it's interesting because exactly what I'm talking about is talk and the place of talk and oracy in the classroom in order to create independent thinkers through specifically dialogic teaching and the Socratic debate. Now, I became really interested in the Socratic debate when I witnessed my NQT mentor almost a decade ago now in the classroom facilitating this discussion where her students were really leading the discussion. They were probing each other, they were articulating their ideas about an unseen text, something they'd never studied before. Now, I was fascinated as an NQT about how she had managed the behavior, how she had created a culture and an environment where every student was engaged. And that kind of really got me thinking about the key questions that I was having. And I've kind of written them down here for you to see. So whenever I think about oracy and the place of talk in the classroom, particularly in the English classroom, but also across the curriculum, I think about, well, how do we know that effective discussions are actually taking place in our classrooms? How do we ensure that every student is engaged when discussions are taking place? And I'm sure that, when we've had group discussion, I have definitely, where some students will opt out, they become passengers in the classroom. But how do we ensure that every student is engaged then? How do we create independent thinkers through debate and discussion? And how do we know that discussions will lead to thoughtful and developed ideas and writing? And I really want to make it clear that talk isn't just as a result, writing isn't as a result of talk, and talk isn't just for the purpose of writing. That talk has a place individually, is important and significant in the English classroom. And I think, when the government made the decision to make spoken language and speaking and listening just an endorsement, they kind of diminished the role that talk can really have. And when I saw my mentor delivering this Socratic seminar, I was really interested to find out about the principles behind this Socratic seminar that got students to probe and engage, where every student was involved in this discussion and debate in one form or another. And it was really important because it led me to this piece of research. So Robin Alexander's Towards Dialogic Teaching was the first thing I read. And more recently, actually, he's written a dialogic teaching classroom. And in it, he defines dialogic teaching as a pedagogy of the spoken word, which harnesses the power of dialogue that stimulates and extends students' thinking, learning, knowing, understanding, and enables them to discuss, reason, and argue. Note that he doesn't once mention writing, although we will talk about that in a moment. In his piece of research, he discusses how dialogic teaching is almost rejects the traditional mode of classroom talk that centers around the IRF model. And I've written down in brackets what that stands for. It's not to say that the IRF model, where we initiate a question, listen to a student's response, and kind of give feedback on that response, doesn't have a place. It's just that when you are delivering the dialogic teaching in the Socratic seminar, it is almost rejecting that particular model. And in it, he discusses these 8 repertoires at the center of his approach. And I am going to be honest, because the talk is mostly about this Socratic strategy, I am going to guide you towards the research, because I won't delve too deep into this. So he talks about the interactive culture, how we manage that talk, how we explain to students what the rituals and rules are, essentially. He doesn't like to use the word ground rules in his research, but it's an easier way of understanding what he's talking about there. So for example, how do we get students to understand how they listen effectively, how they talk effectively? So you'll actually set it up in the classroom where you constantly remind them, and you can see how that links to the teacher standards of behavior for learning and high expectations. The interactive settings, he even considers how the classroom is set up. It talks about groupings, it talks about the time that's allocated. In the research, he talks about learning talk. How do we learn talk? How do our students learn that talk? And he even places emphasis on the way in which we as teachers talk, that we model those practices to our students. He then mentions these other repertoires of questioning, extended, discussing, and arguing. So, as I said, I saw this in my NQT year now over a decade ago. And I'm going to now go through the strategy and how you can implement it in your own classroom. So there are two different ways of doing it. So as he talked about in the interactive settings, we need to think about the groupings and the way the classroom space is set up. So the way Teresa Dunseith did it, who was my NQT mentor, was that the classroom was in a horseshoe shape. You had a group of students who were part of the inner circle. They were going to discuss whatever was in front of them. So whether it was an unseen poetry poem, whether it was an unseen extract from a play they'd been studying, whether it was a short story, it could even be a student's piece of writing that you want to use as a model. And you have that stimuli that the students in the inner circle discuss. On the outer circle, you have the other students, and they have a range of different roles. Now, the outer circle students are also observing the inner circle students. There are specific students that might be tagged and allocated to watch the specific student. So student F might be asked to watch student A, for example. And they're given a success criteria that is co-created with you as the teacher. And I must kind of emphasize at this point that so much of the Socratic is about ensuring that you have a positive classroom culture where students feel safe to make mistakes, where students feel safe to be able to develop and discuss their ideas openly without fear of shame or rejection, that students really know that there are going to be no passengers in the classroom, that no one can opt out. So the outer circle, they're given this success criteria that you've co-created with them. They really understand it, that everybody in that classroom understands the success criteria, and I'll show you that in a moment. And then you'll also have these other roles, so you can develop the kind of thinking and the speaking and listening strategies and these repertoires that he talks about. So, for example, Teresa used to include, and I've kind of continued her legacy, I guess, the listening skills. Well, there's going to be a specific student who looks at the whole group in the inner circle. Who's sustaining the concentrated listening? How do you know they're listening? What do they do to show that they're listening? Who's sustaining the discussion? And these will all be different students looking at different things. You can even have students who kind of look at the metacognitive process. Well, when someone gets stuck, what happens? How do they overcome those barriers? What cognitive strategies do they actually implement? And how do they monitor and then evaluate those specific strategies? And what I tend to also do is have one student, usually my highest prioritainer or a student that really loves to kind of contribute to discussion on the outside. So you really personalize every kind of role for those students. And what I tend to do with that student is say, you are going to watch the discussion, you're going to make notes, and then what you're going to do is tell us what was left out of the discussion. And that is a really important aspect of kind of summarizing and synthesizing that discussion. You can also think about it as a mini Socratic. So a whole class discussion really does take a bit of planning, but really your role as a teacher then is to facilitate that discussion. You might have a post-it note in front of you, write some sentence starters for students who aren't contributing to the discussion to encourage them. You could write a question down to get them to think about it so that they can still contribute to the discussion. What you could do though is to kind of ease your workload and your planning is have just this slide in front of you. So mini Socratic debate, you have a question like this. So Priestes and Inspector Calls is socialist propaganda and is conditioning the youth to become lefties. You can see the success criteria that we've created here. We've co-created that success criteria, and it's also something that we use later on in the writing. You then can see that there's Socratic roles. Now these aren't personalized. So with the whole class Socratic, I would actually write down individual students' names. You know, person A, B, C, D, E, F, you are going to do exactly this. And these roles might be linked to your success criteria, to your assessment objectives, like they are here. With the Socratic role with the mini Socratic, you can kind of be a bit free, I guess, if you want to kind of ease your workload and your planning, where you just say, okay, you're going to be in these groups, you've put them in groups, you decide in your groups which role you are going to have. Are you going to be part of the discussion? Are you going to be an observer? Which specific roles? What you could do is really guide those students and say, person A, I really want you to think about doing this particular role. And again, that's really personalized approach. And what you'll end up doing is the first time you do it, it can be a bit chaotic. I have to be really honest. That's exactly what it was like with me. But the more you do it with the same class, the more you'll see how passionate they become, how excited they become. Every time I now say that it's Socratic, they love it. They absolutely love it because they get to explore their own ideas in a safe environment and in a safe culture. With the observers in the mini Socratic, again, they're making notes, you're guiding them on what they're making notes on. And then you can have the feedback session. So this can be a whole period. where all you do is the Socratic debate, or you could minimize it. So you could have a 10-minute mini Socratic and then a 5 or 10-minute feedback. And what you then do is get the students to feed back to you. You can target those specific students, or you could kind of let the whole class give feedback on what they've noticed. What you then do is you as a teacher collate all their ideas. So you have now this bank of critical ideas and interpretations and analysis that you've got that have been generated by the students. And then you can use the I do, we do, you do approach to model how to then turn those notes into writing. And you might need to do that quite a few times, as Rosenshine says, small steps. But eventually you'll see that they can do it themselves because you modeled and scaffolded it for them. If you would like to know more, here's the information. I would really recommend you read Robin Alexander's A Dialogic Teaching Companion. It's a bit cheaper on Kindle as well if you want to. And the EEF project that the research is kind of focused on is, I've got a link to that here as well. Thank you very much. You can contact me at Miss YBB, or you can have a look at my blog for the resources too. Thank you very much.
Hi, thank you so much. That was really, really good. I'm sorry, the coffee machine just went on. That was really, really great. So there are some questions here from Emma. How do you encourage reluctant pupils to take part on those?
Yeah. So because if you know your students really, really well, you will know exactly who will be reluctant and who won't be. And I think it's really important to have sentence starters. I provide sentence starters. I might provide questions to help guide them. And as I said in the talk, what I might do in my in my role as a facilitator is observe. I don't talk. I might probe. I might use questioning to probe them, but I might just have a post-it and write sentence starters on the post-it and just quietly leave it on the desk, which I used to see my mentor do. And I used to always wonder what she did. And I realized very quickly that what she was doing is engaging those speakers. And I say that because I before lockdown, that's something that, dialogic teaching and Socratic seminars had a real place in my classroom. And I had in my top set year 10 class, I had these students who were very good at writing, but maybe not very articulate were fearful of speaking in public. And so by having those sentence starters or questions on the post-it and just putting it in front of them, you're also really supporting them. You're almost saying, I've got your back, I won't let you down. I'm here for you. And I will ensure that I will support you in any way. You're creating that interactive culture, like Robin Alexander says. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, I think it is. Yeah. There's a question about, I think similar, but how do you go around this for students with anxiety or autism spectrum disorder?
I think that this is really important. Again, it's that personalization. You really need to know and understand your students. So it might be that with those specific needs or students with complex needs, you might just get them to observe for the while. For the first couple of times, you might get them to observe so they become more and more confident. And then you might ask them, would you like to be part of it? Because I think it's really important to know your knowledge of your students is so key with the Socratic, because if you don't know their needs, you're really going to struggle to control and manage that behavior as well. So that's why I say, creating an environment where positive behavior for learning is the norm is so important.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. There were two questions from Sophie and from Rima. They are kind of the same. So how do you effectively manage a debate like this so it doesn't go off topic? And then if you do any preparation beforehand so that it gets less chaotic as possible?
Yeah, and this is where I'll share the resource with you, but you can also see it in my blog. There's a slide that I use, and there's actually a worksheet, a document that I might print out, and it's got all their names on it. Every single student's name is on that document, and they all have the roles that they're allocated. You tell them beforehand. I forgot to mention this, thank you for that. At the beginning of that Socratic debate, you as a teacher are still in charge. You need to establish the norms. You need to remind them of the norms and the expectations. And I'm not going to lie to you. I have had Socratics at the beginning when I was chaotic, especially when I was an NQT and an RQT and was really struggling to manage everything. So I'd be lying to you if I said I was able to do that like this. It is something, as I said, dialogic teaching is something that it needs to be established time and time again. And it's something that you create. It's a culture you create in your classroom to manage that. You might want to stop that conversation if it does divert and say, okay, let's go back to it, almost like a chairperson. Can we go back to it one person at a time? Or, so you are reiterating as the teacher what the expectations are.
Yeah, sounds good. There are lots of questions still coming. I'm just going to tell everybody to take that to Twitter because we only have time for one more. So, So the last question is very specific for this time now. Have you given any thought on how you're going to do that when we go back to class and we have to keep social distancing or small groups and etc.?
Yes, I mean, I've done it in a group of like 6 students, where 3 students have observed and 3 students have just kind of been part of the discussion group, and then they swap roles. So you can say, you know, you've got 5 minutes to discuss this, and almost like a starter activity. So you can read. This is why I love it. I think, you know, I get really passionate about it because you can use it as a starter, a main, you know, whatever you want really, because it's so adaptable. It's essentially placing talk at the heart of your curriculum, placing talk at the heart of your classroom, and giving the students the space to discuss something. So it might be that I have a starter activity that focuses on Priestley's kind of a specific extract in the play. Let's just discuss very quickly. Let's use Socratics. And it is something I've been thinking about because we do remote live learning at Forest Gate Community School, which is where I'm kind of an assistant head. And I've been really thinking about how I can encourage this. And it is something that I've been thinking about, and I might write about it. But if you have any ideas, guys, please let me know.
That's great. Thank you so much. Sorry you don't have more time, but thank you so much. I'm sure that you get a lot of questions on Twitter after this. So next one, and our final speaker for the day is Jennifer Webb. Jenny, you there?
Hello all. I'll just share my screen.
Yep, thank you. Yes.
Here we go. Yep. Can you all see that?
Yes.
Marvelous. Okay, so good morning, afternoon. It's 12:15. It's such a pleasure to be closing this conference. It's been brilliant. It's been a real delight to see all the other speakers because a lot of the things I'm going to talk about, I think, fit in with some of the things I've been saying. So the things that Patrice was saying about modelling and about kind of having that really obvious, almost kind of metacognitive process being made really explicit to students. And what Yamina was just saying, Yamina was just saying now about Socratic talk and asking the right questions and prompting and probing are all going to kind of come into what I'm going to talk about. So my name is Jenny. I am the Assistant Principal for Teaching and Learning at Cork Academy Leeds, which is a large secondary school in the inner city. I've written a couple of books, which you can see there and you can get on Amazon if you want, but all the resources from all my books are available for free on my website, so please check that out. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about is some of the things in my literature book, but kind of enhanced by lots of the things that I've been thinking since, because I wrote it kind of a while ago now. So I want to talk about the balance in the English classroom between learning stuff, which is really important, and learning how to think using that stuff. So by stuff, I mean all of that key content, facts, dates, names, conventions, etc., etc., etc. So I'm a massive believer in teaching a really heavy knowledge-based curriculum and making sure we keep the challenge really, really, really high and make sure our kids know lots and lots of things. I'm all for anything that's about getting students to learn and retain information, such as kind of high level vocabulary and symbolism and context and all of that stuff. It's really, really critical. But they must then be able to give that stuff some meaning. They must be able to do something with it, which is not only going to make sense, but also is going to really, really advance their arguments. So what I want to talk about is how we can create literary thinkers. And something that I've been playing with a lot more in the last year is thinking about sequences of questions, which are essentially building towards metacognition. So what I want my students to believe about themselves and to understand in my classroom is that when they are studying literature, they are literary critics. They are contributing to a wider body of critical work. So when they write an essay, they become part of that critical world of all the other people, all the academics, everybody who has ever commented on that same text or that same theme or idea. So in that way, they are taking part in a timeless conversation about art, because essentially that's what we're doing in literature. We're talking about art. It's all about kind of admiring and commenting on and exploring and interrogating something that another human being has created. we're also giving shape to that art. So it's a really important thing for them to understand that by engaging with a novel, or by watching a play, or by reading a poem and interrogating it and pulling it apart, they give shape to that art, they give meaning to that art. You could argue in many ways that it's not a poem unless it's read, and that by engaging with that text in the first place, you give it substance. Okay. Another thing that I want them to understand is that they are also a social commentator. So by interrogating literature and exploring it and enjoying it, they're able to make comments about, or have a better understanding of, what that text tells us about the society in which it was created, or what the reception of that text tells us about wider society now, etc., etc. And the big one for me is always about the human condition. And if you've been in any of my CPD sessions recently, you'll kind of have heard this before. So the idea that to study literature is to observe the human condition. And I want my children, my students in my classroom, to see all of these things as being part of their study of literature. To study literature is to become all of these things. So what I'd like them to be doing is to become explicitly aware of the work that they do. So that abstract thing of talking about why a curtain is blue becomes something really, really tangible and meaningful, because actually they're not just talking about a blue curtain, they're not just talking about a symbol, they're talking about that symbol and how it relates to things in a broader sense. Okay, so for anyone who's not really it's not just about the final product, it's about consciously going on a journey. So it's not just about the essay they produce or the exam mark they get. It's about consciously going on a journey to explore and understanding the stages of that journey for yourself. So for anyone who doesn't know what metacognition is, I'm just going to say very, very, very quickly. Metacognition is just a fancy word for thinking about thinking and being aware of your own thoughts, your own thought processes. So essentially it's about being able to say with a piece of work, I recognize that I found this difficult, that I overcame it in this way, and that these things helped, or this was really challenging because in the future I'm going to approach this differently in this way. There is a huge amount of research that suggests that students who are able to think and work metacognitively make an additional 7 months of progress in a 12-month period. I would recommend checking out Alex Quigley's work on metacognition with the Education Endowment Foundation. So there's an EEF report on metacognition, which is excellent as a starting point. So one of the statements I had at the start was, you are giving shape to the art you encounter. Okay, so what that means for my students is that in real life, they're presenting clear, well thought out, well expressed interpretations. So writing a really good essay, which expresses very clearly what you think about it. Okay. And like I said, is it a novel if it isn't being read? Do we as the readers give it life? Because otherwise it's just words on a page. So getting my students to recognize that their reading of it adds, actively turns this into an experience, okay, rather than just words on a page, is really, really important. So one of the ways that I try and get my students to think about this is by looking at revision and redraft. So I know you can all read, but I'm just going to read this to you. So Patricia Taylor, who is a lecturer in academic writing in the States, who's brilliant, says that revision, so redrafting, is about seeing again. It's not just about fixing spelling, punctuation and grammar. It's about seeing what you have written again. So revision is about the real work of addressing one's failures in thinking, not merely in typing and proofreading. So when students redraft an essay, it's not just about them checking what's wrong in terms of the practical stuff like spellings. It's about them addressing how well they have expressed an argument. It's about the content and the process of their own thought. Much of the academic writing process is flexible and recursive. It assumes that failure will be a necessary component. While there is a general order to these things, at any point a failure might cause us to return to an earlier step and begin again. So I think this is a really, really important point. If we want our children to be literary thinkers, we need to get them to embrace redrafting as a way of seeing again their own arguments and interrogating them and making sure they are as brilliant as possible. So I like to get my students to be conscious of that writing process. They know from the start they're going to draft and redraft. They know that this is part of the way that they develop their ideas. So here's an example. Often I'll get students to write an essay, and then this is quite an old example because you can see at the bottom it says this is an A-star paragraph, nailed it, and we don't have A-stars anymore, but never mind, just a good example. It's about revisiting the work at every stage. So once they've done their process and they've written an essay, I like to get my students to go back and articulate for themselves, I did X, then I changed Y and Z, Y and Z was the impact. Then I changed P and Q was the impact. So they're able to see that redrafting is very, very powerful. They're able to say, oh, do you know what? During that essay process, I changed the way this was phrased, or I changed the way I introduced this critical viewpoint, and this was the impact on my writing, this made it better. Then I changed this, and this was the impact. And it's about them constantly going back and reminding themselves, actually, that redrafting is really important. You're hammering it home. If you don't redraft, you don't get better. If you don't redraft, you don't have a beautiful kind of, a beautiful piece of writing that is really, really well expressed, okay? So that's really important. So some of the questions that I think about for my students: what did you change in your second draft? What was the impact? How can you ensure you'll write at this level the first time, next time? And what's the next step? So it's always about saying, what did you do? How did you change it? Will you ensure that this is better the next time you do it? So the next time you start at a higher level and then you can go even further. An example of one of my students, so this is a student who's quite severely dyslexic. And we've been working a lot on phrasing and vocabulary. So this is one of his later pieces of writing once we've been working on that. And we went through this process and we did lots of, what did you change in this draft? Show me what you changed. Was it effective? Why was it effective? What has it done? You can link that to an exam spec if you want to, but you really don't have to. How can you make sure that you always do this next time, and then we can do the next step? So, for example, this student is suddenly starting to highlight in his own work, oh, I used phrases like on closer inspection, upon first glance, words like fragile. I've said that something is a pivotal moment. In a previous draft, he might have said, this is an important quote. Whereas saying on closer inspection, we can see how profound this is, or something like that, or saying this is a moment where the character feels tense. Actually saying this is a pivotal moment in the play is a far better use of phrasing and vocabulary. So through using repeated questions like this, where I'm getting them to think about the metacognitive process, think about the importance of drafting, and identify all the good stuff that they've changed, they do it better the next time, and every single time they get better and better and better. It just accumulates. Okay. Getting students to be a literary critic, to understand that they contribute to that wider body of work, and understand that they are taking part in a timeless conversation, is really, really important for me. So this is, again, quite a lot of text, but I'm just going to explain it to you. So Kenneth Burke, who's a philosopher, basically kind of imagined this this kind of coffee parlor, okay, that is going on forever, and it's been going, the coffee parlor has been open since the beginning of time, and people started to write. In that parlor, there are people, you come in and there are people having a really heated discussion, okay? They are talking over each other, they're responding to each other, and they're talking about texts. So let's say, for example, they're all talking about women in Romeo and Juliet, okay? You walk in, you can hear people having conversations, you sit down, you listen, you think about whether or not you understand what their argument is, and then you start to put in your own arguments, okay? You make your point, somebody answers you, you answer them, another person adds to your point or argues against you, whatever. You become part of that literary conversation. And then eventually, when you're a bit tired and it's late, you leave, but the conversation's still going on. Since you've been there, other people have come in and people have gone out, and it's just this constant discussion. That is what Kenneth Burke sees the kind of the world of literary theory being, the idea that anybody can contribute to the discussion. So you might have Stephen Greenblatt talking about new historicism in that text at some point in that coffee house's history. When you come in later on, you're contributing to the same conversation. So I want my students to understand that when they write an essay or when they espouse an opinion about a text, they are equally making really, really important contributions to that wonderful conversation over time. Okay, and that's really, really, really important. That they are, no matter whether they are 15-year-olds reading a play for the first time, or they have 3 PhDs and they're lecturing in a university, they are all contributing to that academic conversation, and they should always be aspiring to that. So one of the ways I do that, oh, this is not working the way I want it to, that's really annoying. So behind that box there, that you'll see there are some statements underneath. So I'm just going to give you kind of an example. I've done the animation wrong, unfortunately, but never mind. I have a list, and it's on my website anyway, but I have a list of statements about texts which I give students, and the ones that I've done as examples are from the AQA Power and Conflicts anthology, but there are lots of others you could use. And essentially I use statements about texts to get students to engage with to engage with opinions and be confident as commentators on kind of literary ideas. I want them to be engaging with those as much as possible and to feel confident to give their own opinions. So for example, one of these things at the bottom that you can actually see, it says such and such, so writer's name, constantly challenges the views of society and interrogates the reader's own preconceptions. Is that something you agree with? Is that something you disagree with? Okay. So and so name is consumed by emotion and unable to control the fury they feel. Do you agree that in exposure, Owen is consumed by emotion and unable to control the fury he feels as a writer? Is that something that just oozes out of the poem, or is that something that you think is actually more contained? So getting my students to engage with that argument and decide. Writer's name articulates the pain they feel at being mistreated and misunderstood by their own country. That's a statement that about the poem The Emigre by Carol Rumens. So Rumens articulates the pain that the speaker feels at being mistreated and misunderstood in their own country, in the country of their birth. Sorry, not the country of their birth, the country that they now live in. So again, giving them a statement about a text and getting them to engage with it is about kind of getting them used to giving their opinion and making them think that they're critics. And I always say to my students, what do you think though? No, but your opinion is really important. You're a critic. If you're going to use a critical viewpoint in your essay, if you're going to say that you know a Marxist theorist would think this or would argue this, you need to feel confident enough to handle that material. You need to be able to say it like you're just as good as a Marxist theorist, that you can confidently put forward these ideas like you know what you're talking about, you're a boss, and that when you then engage with it and say, however, I think this might be a more useful way of looking at it, or actually, in addition, I find this to be an interesting thing to consider, blah, blah, blah. You need to be able to add to that conversation without being scared of it, okay? Another resource that I like to use, and again, this is on my website, in order to get students to engage with critical ideas and be part of that conversation in a meaningful way, is that I give them this statement card, which you can see on the screen now with the green border. So in the middle, you give them the statement or the viewpoint or the question that they're engaging with. What they do with that, and this is explained on my website in quite a lot of detail, so you can see it there, but what they do with that is that they, first of all, they look at the words used in the statement, so they define the terms. What could those words mean? What else could they mean? How are you personally defining them? They look at the context of the statement. So does the context of that statement matter? Does it change the nature of the statement if you have a different context? What's its natural context? What are the other possible contexts? Is there a solution to the problem or question? Could you change the statement to make it better? That's a really powerful thing to do, because sometimes some of the best essays I've ever seen, particularly at A-level, are where students at the very end say, the question I'm answering, so they're essentially saying the question I'm answering is an interesting one, but a more pertinent question about this text would be this. And that's a really powerful thing. It shows that the student has taken complete ownership of the task. Range, what's the range of impact of the statement? Is this just a statement about a human being, or is this about all human beings? Is it a global statement? Is it something about what we are as humans, or is it something about what this particular group or this specific person is like? Okay, and then the extremes. What are the extreme applications of the statement? So does it become really, really ridiculous if you take it to its extreme, etc.? So here's an example. So if the statement is literature is just a pale shadow of real life and is therefore unable to tell us anything new, then we might go start with words. How do you define literature? Is it just the classic works of the canon, or does it include everything that's ever been written? What do we mean by new? New to who? Does literature actually have to offer new things? So you're interrogating all of the vocabulary, all the ideas in that statement, okay? Because that's important. They have to be able to attack it and feel confident enough to attack it, because that is what a good academic would do. Context. What are the different contexts? So reading for pleasure is a different context to academic study, for example. A solution. Literature shouldn't have to tell us something new, and it certainly doesn't have to be an exact mirror image of real life. So let's change the statement. We could change the statement to literature should reflect, distort, magnify, and illuminate elements of human experience. So actually, let's change it to make it more powerful. Range and extremes. I won't go through those in detail because I want to get through everything, but you can have a look at that on the website, and that's a really nice way of training students to address a really difficult idea. So you could use a critical viewpoint if you're trying to teach them feminist theory, get a statement in the middle, get them to work through it. It works really, really well. So in terms of the questions, for my metacognitive questions for getting students to engage in the conversation, what do you think? What is your opinion? Have you read and understood the key arguments? I talked at the LitDrive CPD about getting students to do a literature review, and I've put the resources on my website, but it's in my most recent book in the academic writing chapter. Can highly recommend getting students at all levels, even from year 7, to write a literature review. Anyway, next one. How far have you engaged with these arguments? So what are the key arguments in this area? So like we said, the presentation of women in Romeo and Juliet. What are the key critical arguments in this area? How far have you engaged with these arguments? How have these arguments contributed to your own thesis? So have you just listened to them and you're like a brick wall and it hasn't changed the way you think? Or have you allowed those arguments to adapt and shift and alter the way that you think? Because that's what an academic does. They don't just ignore and stick to their one idea that they had at the start. They allow their reading to adapt how they think. What further work do you think needs to be done, and how will you address this? So in future, in another essay, what other reading would you want to do? Is there something missing? Okay. And how will your approach to critical perspectives be easier next time? So next time I'm going to start at this point. Next time I'm going to make sure I do this, this, and this. So it's about that. What did you do? How did it help? And what's your plan for next time? That's the essential theory of metacognition. Recognizing what you did, thinking about whether it was good, whether it was bad, what worked, what didn't work, and then how will it be different next time? Okay, and the last bit is on being a social commentator and observing the human condition. And this is the bit for me that students often find really, really abstract and difficult. But essentially, all it's saying is you need to be able to say, what's this telling us about people? What are the characters like? What are we supposed to think about these characters? What events happen? What are we supposed to think about them? What's the writer trying to say overall? So one of the resources I quite like to use for this is this is actually a way of comparing 2 poems and 2 narrative voices in 2 poems. But essentially, it's a way of taking abstract ideas like the emotional and mental kind of state of the speaker in a poem, and finding a way to visually represent it. So getting students to answer questions like, how does the speaker feel? What kind of language imagery is being used? How does the reader feel? And getting them to think really, really carefully about what is going through the head of that, what is going through the head of that figurative, what am I saying? Going through the head of that fictional person generally, unless it's a direct speech from the poet themselves. But there's an example of one that's been done by a student. I showed this in a drama session the other day, but it's worth showing again. I like using this, and I developed this after a conversation with Kat Howard on Twitter, actually, because she's so clever. But looking at how a character is presented physically. So how do they act, move, speak? What do they do to show you how they're feeling? How are they presented emotionally? So what does the character say about their feelings? How does their language and the things they do show us what they're thinking and feeling? And then psychologically, so what is the overall statement being made about the character's mental state? How have they been impacted by events and ideas? What is the character trying to say, and how is the reader supposed to react to the character's experience? So we go from the literal to the kind of more symbolic, the broader kind of ideas, and those, getting students to think in that way, getting students to think about characters and what they're doing and how they're thinking, can be really, really important. I also like to use a list of questions. Apologies for the poor animations on this slide, but never mind. So the first thing, I give my students a list of questions often to help them interrogate a text. So here are some of them as examples. So what are the moments of highest tension in the text? How do characters act under pressure? So how characters act under pressure can tell us a lot about how the writer feels about human beings and how they act under pressure. When people are put in extreme situations, often the most powerful representations of their beliefs come out. I mean, we can see that right now with the Black Lives Matter movement. Things have come to such a heightened emotional point where people cannot take the treatment anymore. They can't take the systemic abuse anymore, and all of a sudden it's a pressure cooker and it's just gone. And that's telling us a lot about how people behave when they feel completely powerless and they feel completely kind of overwhelmed by emotion. And that's really, really important for us to take note of. And we can do the same thing when we look at literature. We can look at how characters behave when they are experiencing extreme grief, how they behave when they are backed into a corner, how they behave when they are drunk, how they behave when they are really, really happy or really, really jealous, all of those things. What are the events that make people change their mind? What are the most obvious meaningful symbols at the start? That's important. So what's setting the weather in the text? What's the first thing we see? What are the key meaningful symbols at the end? So what are the things we're being left with? Are there any events, actions or decisions which will be difficult for the audience or the reader to empathize with or forgive or forget? There are always those moments where you go, oh, that's evil, or I can't believe they did that, or I will never, ever, ever forget that moment in that text. If anyone's read The Long Song by Andrea Levy, the final kind of realization of what has happened in that, and I won't give you a spoiler, but it hits you like a train when you realize what has happened, and that will never, ever, ever leave me. I honestly thought I was going to be sick when I finished that book. It's amazing, read it. But it's one of those moments where you just go, oh, the reader will never get over that. They will never forgive that. Do you get a sense that people can't do or don't change? Can people be good or have no choice, or are they both good and evil? Is there a sense that people are responsible, have control, or are they not responsible at all and it's all about fate? Is life hard, easy, a test, a trial, a punishment, a gift? People are fickle, vulnerable, weak, strong, ignorant, selfish. What is the writer saying? And these questions for me often help students to get to that point where they're able to observe humanity through the text. Here are some examples of kind of statements students have come up with. So Blake presents an image of humanity which is fundamentally weak and cruel. I won't read them all, but it's a really, really nice kind of way of getting students to go through those questions and then use those questions and their answers to them to create powerful statements. And this resource is on my blog, and this helps my students to then take all that understanding and structure a really beautiful statement, if that makes sense. So there's an example there. I won't talk you through it, but it's on my blog and it's all free. This is called the Bird's Eye View statements resource, I think. So here are the metacognitive kind of questions. Have you considered what this text tells us about wider human issues? What are the key messages? How do they manifest themselves in your essay? Have you expressed yourself clearly? Is it plausible? How does this approach improve your academic writing? And how might you link your understanding of this text, wider themes, to your next literature study? So again, what were your ideas? What have you done? Was it successful? How did it help? And how will you do it again? So it's all about those questions, getting students to be able to take that abstract, I'm reading a book and talking about my feelings, to a tangible, I am a literary scholar. I am taking part in a conversation. I am observing what human beings are through the art that they create. And these questions really, really, really help me to get my students to that point. And those questions might be given on the board. They might be questions that I ask them verbally. They might be questions that are on resources. It might be a prompt that I use in marking. It might be something that I go through as an actual resource that has all the questions on it and they're filling it all in. It's variable, but it really, really, really helps in my experience. So I hope that wasn't just a load of waffle. Hopefully that was helpful. I'm going to stop screen sharing in a second, go back into this.
Yeah,
there we are.
See you. Yeah, brilliant. Thank you very much, Danny. That was great. And we have some questions here for you. So I just want to, before that, just thank everybody for staying in this conference and coming and learning with us. I really do appreciate that. So question from Jessica. How do you create a culture where students think beyond the literal? She says she finds it really hard and usually she does the heavy work. So she offers the interpretations and all of that.
Yeah, so I think building on what Mark said in his talk, and what Patrice was kind of saying, this idea that we really, really have to model that stuff. There's nothing wrong with saying to kids, this is what I think it means, because you are the expert, you're the person who knows what they're talking about. And the more you do that, the more confident they can be that they're standing on solid ground. And literal things are really important. They have to feel like they're talking about something real. Otherwise, it just becomes this anchorless kind of place where you get lost. I think literature sometimes, especially if you're reading a big long novel, children can get kind of lost in it and they need something to ground them. So take that literal stuff. That resource that I showed you with the physically, emotionally, psychologically, starts with what do they actually do. So it's a literal thing. This character walks across the stage and does this thing. That's a really easy thing for kids to talk about. If they then take that to at the next level and think about, well, what does that tell us about how they're feeling, or what does that tell us about what the writer kind of is getting at, and then take that to the next level and think, well, actually, if that is what the writer is presenting, how does the writer want us to extrapolate that? Is there an application for that beyond? And it's about building it up, I think. So model it, model your thinking, tell them the answers, and over time they will start to do it for themselves. It's all about modeling. And those questions, it's nothing new, going through like questions to help them structure the way they think. The questions I've just given you on those slides, they are the way you go from like, this is what I did, to this is why, and that was why it was powerful, and this is how it's enhanced what I'm doing. And actually it frees them to start doing that more regularly, I think. Yeah,
that's a very good answer, very detailed. That's great. And then there are a couple of questions more practical. So about your idea of getting them to draft and redraft, doesn't that increase teacher workload and marking load too much?
So let me make this really clear. I do not write on student work ever. I don't do written marking. It's a massive waste of time. What I would say is think about how you mark full stop. And obviously that's not always in your control. That's maybe your head of department or head teacher or whatever. But there's a blog on my, there's a post on my blog called Zero Written Feedback, a Trial. And have a look at that. That kind of explains what I do. But basically, I'll read everything they've done. I will not write on it. So it'll take me a minute to read what they've done. It will take me 5 minutes to mark. So I can read everything in 30 minutes. The idea is not that I should be doing the work for them. The idea is that redrafting, oh, thank you, someone just put the blog link in the chat. But the idea is that they should be doing the work. It's their work. It's their stuff. It should not be up to me to carry 30 kids. It should be up to them to lead their own learning. So basically, they write something and then I will give them a whole class feedback with questions. And did you do this? Did you do this? A lot of people didn't do this. You need to make sure that you weren't one of those people. Go back and fix it. So it gives them directions on how to improve that work. But they have to do it themselves. It is not my job to circle every capital letter for them to then ignore what I've done. I'm over that. I'm not about that life anymore.
Yeah, sounds good. I think that also answers Claire's question that was about how can you do all of the revisiting and redrafting when you have a whole curriculum to cover and exam boards.
Well, that's a really good question. And a lot of people say that. I talk about this quite a lot in my new book, and it's about slowing everything down. So rather than teaching, say, a unit on a particular novel and writing an essay every single week that's on a different topic, I would rather see students write fewer essays, but write a few essays lots and lots of times and make them perfect. It's about making sure that we're not writing 6 essays that are all a bit rubbish and then we've moved on and not learned a lot from it, and actually writing 3 essays or even 2 essays that are awesome, because once they've done that, they have a really, really good grasp of what excellent writing looks like. And then when by the time you get to Key Stage 4, students know what a brilliant essay looks like, and then you can start showing them how to do that in shorter time. And you know, that's the key. Yeah,
good. So question from Emma: how would you encourage low ability students who are reluctant to engage with texts and struggle to see beyond the literal to engage and push up their thinking?
So again, it's about giving them those questions. For me, modelling is absolutely vital. So Patrice's talk was really, really good. I model every single lesson. I model sentences. I model the way I speak and think through things. I model how I annotate a line, and then that turns into a point, and then I might write about it. It's absolutely crucial that they see that all the time. And with for me, lower prior attaining students often do better at literature than they would at language, because literature is about them being able to express interesting opinions. It's not about fluency, it's not about perfection, it's not about spelling, punctuation and grammar and all of that stuff being technically accurate. They could get a decent mark in literature by saying brilliant things, even if the way they say it isn't awesome. Getting those students up to the symbolic, getting them up to that higher level, is about modeling it all the time. If you've got students who have got a target of a 3, don't model a 4, model an 8. And it's your job as a teacher to scaffold up to that, to find a way to open that up for them. Teach them sentences, like what Mark was saying, like breaking down and getting them to literally learn sentence structures. I do it all the time. This is how you do it. When they make a point, my students always go writer's name, analytical verb, make your point, comma, quotation. They know that it's like a formula, and they can always just get in. It's about modeling at high standards all the time, and they'll get there. And even if it means that at the start they're kind of copying you and paraphrasing you, that's great, because mimicry leads to embedded understanding, leads to independence.
Yep. Do you explain those things to them, this like cognitive working?
Yeah, I tell them what they're doing all the time. Students can understand educational theory just as well as we can if we explain it properly. And remember, we're teachers. So if we tell them, this is what you're doing, and actually this is why your brain likes it. I tell my kids that all the time. They understand why they do recall at the start of every single lesson. They understand that. I mean, as an aside, we use Seneca in my department. We love Seneca. My students love Seneca. I have students who don't engage very well with homework, who were doing like 5 hours of Seneca quizzing a week last year before their exams on literature. Amazing. So I tell my kids, you do recall all the time for these reasons. This is cognitive science. If you'd like some examples of resources of how to explain cognitive science to your kids to get them more engaged, again, I've got a blog on memory and recall which shares the exact way that I do it with my students. But they all get it, they all understand it, they all know the theorists involved as well. I'm like, you're clever enough to understand this, I'm going to tell you.
Yeah, that's good. I agree with that completely. So there was a question asking, what is your first thing that you do with a class when you start a new text or a new poem? How do you introduce it, and how do you hook them, the students?
Okay, so for me, I try not to think too much about hook, because from there you kind of get into the dangerous zone of how do I make it fun, and I don't want to make it fun. I want it to be really hard, and I want them to just engage because they value their education and they want to succeed. So I always start longer texts with a cold read, like we just read it start to end, or we read most of it and get through the story so they know the story, and then we go back and study it properly. Again, I have a blog on that, so have a look if you want to check out a cold read. But if it's a poem, I read them the poem. Sometimes I prepare a reading of the poem, and it's about them hearing it the way it's intended to be read. I don't get students to read it the first time because they always do it wrong. And also, if it's a poem that requires a particular accent that is not an accent that you can do, respectfully, then please don't do it. Please don't read John Agard with your fake Caribbean accent, because that's very offensive. Find a recording online.
Yeah, great. Sorry, there was a comment from Bella. I just want to know your thoughts on that. When studying plays, it's also very helpful to get students to look at what other characters say about another character before they appear. So, so students' views are changed or reinforced when the character actually appears. Is that something that you work with them?
Yeah, I think that's a really, really interesting idea, because we have to look at, so we can look at a character through lots of different lenses. We can look at a character through the lens of other characters. So what do other characters say about them? What do they think about them? What have they said they've done or said as well? So have they already been paraphrased or quoted before they arrive? We can look at characters through the writer's description of them, or what they're wearing, what their context is, where we see them first, what they're holding, what they're doing first. That's really important. But we can also look at characters through the lens of how they are used as a vehicle through the text. So I always say to my students, characters aren't real people, they're a literary device. So they can't start psychoanalyzing a character and saying, but maybe they've got bipolar disorder. Yeah, no, they don't, because they're not real. So they're actually just like a vehicle that the writer is using to drive us through that text. They are a thing. And so we have to look at them in that way as well. So how does that character help to introduce key themes? How do they contribute to moments of climax in the text? What is that character's job? Is it their job to antagonize? Is it their job to act as a catalyst for something? You know, someone like Tybalt in Romeo and Juliet is just this totally two-dimensional character who doesn't develop in any way, but he's there to do a particular job for Shakespeare. Shakespeare's not interested in developing Tybalt. He's interested in getting him into a fight and then killing him off so that he can move on to something else. But Tybalt serves a really important role in the text. Does that make sense? So we have to look at characters through lots of different lenses, I think.
Yep. And then a question from Kat. Would you introduce literary criticism at GCSE if there's not merit for quoting literary critics, or is this more aimed at A-level students?
I would introduce literary criticism in year 7.
Yep.
I think that if we start thinking what's credited at GCSE, that's all I'm going to teach, then we limit our subject to being about exams. Our subject is not about exams. Our subject is about children being able to appreciate art. That's what it is. It's about children being empowered to look at what's around them and have their lives enhanced by reading books and reading poems and seeing plays. It's not about getting a grade. What should happen is we teach our subject really, really bloody well. Yeah. Year 10 and 11, we help children to gear themselves towards that exam, but that's kind of the byproduct of everything else we've done. It's just a side product. They'll do well in their exam if we teach really well from the start. And I teach my kids literary theory from the start. And if you want some tips, like a couple of the ones that I find easier to teach, start with new historicism because it's very easy. Something like I quite like queer theory and performance theory because they're not, because again, they're kind of a really good way of looking at drama. But yeah, just do it all. Like, don't limit them. If we let Michael Gove dictate what we teach in year 7, 8, 9, as well as year 10 and 11, then we're just capitulating. Sorry, I shouldn't get political.
Okay. Well, we are out of time, so it's almost 1 p.m. Can all the speakers switch your cameras back on so we can have like a final bye-bye to everybody. Thank you so much. Thank you so much to all the speakers, and thank you so much to all the 950 people that joined us today. That was really, really amazing, and we were trending number 2 on Twitter, just behind the Queen's birthday, which I think it's not really a loss. Good enough. So thank you very much, and I'll be sharing that link. That link has all the slides from all of the speakers. Every recording gonna go to YouTube, so you can sign up to our YouTube channel and get updated with all the free CPD that we do. Kat's course on Stop Talking About Wellbeing is already available on Seneca, and all the other free resources on Seneca already available for you and your students. So thank you very much to everybody, and have a lovely Saturday. Bye.